Hello everyone, welcome to the Street Crime UK YouTube channel. Thank you for joining us. Please don't forget to like, share and subscribe for more content. Today we look at the Baker Street robbery and how the criminals involved have forever become infamous in their outrageous plans to take what they wanted when they wanted. The Baker Street robbery was the burglary of the safety deposit boxes at the Baker Street branch of Lloyds Bank in London on the night of September the 11th, 1971. A gang tunnelled 40 feet from a rented shop 2 doors away to come up through the floor of the vault. The value of the property stolen is unknown, but sources have claimed that it could be anywhere from £125,000 all the way up to £3 million, which only £231,000 were ever recovered by police. The burglary was planned by Anthony Gavin, a career criminal who was inspired by The Red-Headed League, a short story by Arthur Conan Doyle in which Sherlock Holmes awaits in a bank vault to arrest a gang who have tunnelled in through the bank's floor. Mr. Gavin and his colleagues rented Le Sac, a leather goods shop 2 doors away from the bank, and tunnelled underground towards the Baker Street branch during the weekends. The interior of the vault was mapped out by one of the gang members using an umbrella and the span of his arms to measure the dimensions of the location of the furniture. The gang initially tried to use a jack to force a hole in the vault floor, and when this failed they went on to use a thermal lance. A thermal lance, for those who don't know, is also known as a thermic lance, oxygen lance or burning bar, is a tool that heats and melts steel in the presence of pressurized oxygen to create very high temperatures for cutting. It consists of a long steel tube packed with alloy steel rods, sometimes mixed with aluminium rods to increase the heat output. One end of the tube is placed in a holder and oxygen is fed through the tube. The far end of the tube is preheated and lit by an oxyacetylene torch. An intense stream of burning steel is produced at the working end and can be used to cut rapidly through thick materials including steel and concrete. The tube is consumed by the process within a few minutes. Often used as heavy-duty demolition tools, the thermic lance is also used to remove seized axles of heavy machinery without damaging the bearings or axle housing. This technique is often used on the pins and axles of large equipment such as cranes, ships, bridges and sluice gates. The temperature at which a thermal lance operates varies depending on the environment, but they can be up to 4,500 centigrade or 8,130 Fahrenheit. When this actual technique failed to work for the gang, they used gelignite to blast a way through. Gelignite, also known as blasting gelatin or simply jelly, is an explosive material consisting of collodion cotton, a type of nitrocellulose or gun cotton, dissolved in either nitroglycerin or nitroglycol and mixed with wood pulp and saltpeter, sodium nitrate or potassium nitrate. Once inside, they empty 268 safe deposit boxes whilst inside the bank's vault. The gang had posted a lookout on a nearby roof who was in contact via walkie-talkie, and their broadcasts were accidentally overheard by Robert Rowland, an amateur radio enthusiast. Mr. Rowland went and called the police, who initially did not take him seriously, so he used a small cassette recorder to make a recording of the burglars' conversations. The second time Mr. Rowlands contacted the police, they accepted what he was saying and began hunting for the burglars whilst the break-in was in progress. They searched 750 banks in an 8-mile radius but failed to locate the gang. Police found the members of the gang soon after the break-in. One of the burglars, Benjamin Wolfe, had signed the lease for Le Sac in his own name, and the informers provided information that led to Mr. Gavin. At the end of October in 1971, police arrested Benjamin Wolfe, Anthony Gavin, Reg Tucker and Thomas Stevens. They continued to search for other members of the gang, including one woman, for 5 years after the robbery had occurred, but no further arrests were made. Mr. Gavin, Mr. Tucker and Mr. Stevens were sentenced to 12 years in prison. Mr. Wolfe received a sentence of 8 years, less than the others as he was in his 60s at the time. There have been several rumours connected with the Baker Street robbery, including one that the government issued a D-notice to censor the press, that one of the safety deposit boxes contained compromising photographs of Princess Margaret and the actor and criminal John Bindon, and that photographs of a Conservative cabinet minister abusing children were also allegedly found. There is no evidence to support them, and they have been widely dismissed due to the lack of corroborating proof. Some of the rumours inspired the story for the 2008 film The Bank Job. Many of the papers relating to the Baker Street robbery remain under embargo at the National Archives until January 2071. In 1970, Anthony Gavin, a 38-year-old photographer from North London, began planning the burglary of the branch of Lloyds Bank at 187 Baker Street on the Marylebone district, City of Westminster, London. Mr. Gavin decided to use a nearby premises and tunnel up the floor of the bank. The plan was inspired by The Red-Headed League, a short story by Arthur Conan Doyle. In the story, Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson preempt the burglars and are in the vault when they break in. A former army physical training instructor with connections to several career criminals, Mr. Gavin is described by the journalists Tom Pettifor and Nick Summerland as a forceful personality who had the propensity to be physically threatening. According to Paul Lashmar, the head of journalism at the University of Sussex, Mr. Gavin was a member of a gang headed by Brian Reader, who was also involved in the Baker Street robbery. Although Mr. Reader firmly denies that he had any involvement in the events at Baker Street. Mr. Gavin asked Reg Tucker, a second-hand car salesman who had no criminal record, to reconnoitre the bank. Mr. Tucker opened an account with £500 in December 1970, and 2 months later Mr. Tucker rented a safety deposit box in the branch. Over the next few months, Mr. Tucker visited his safety deposit box a total of 13 times. Bank practice of the time was for staff to leave customers in private whilst visiting the vault for privacy of their clients. As soon as Mr. Tucker was alone, Mr. Tucker would measure the room using the span of his arms and an umbrella. Mr. Tucker was aided in getting the exact measurements by the regularly sized floor tiles, each of which was 9 inches or 23 centimetres. Mr. Tucker drew a map of the room, plotting where the cabinets were and the position of the furniture. Thomas Stevens, another second-hand car salesman with no criminal record, was used to acquire the tools needed for the break-in, including a thermal lance and a 100-ton jack. One of the Reader's friends, Bobby Mills, was employed to be the lookout man for the gang's plan. 2 others were brought in for the job, one of whom was an explosives expert. Another of Mr. Gavin's friends, Mickey Skinny Gervais, a burglar alarm expert, was brought on board, as were 2 men who have never been identified formally, but nicknamed Little Legs and TH. Mr. Lashmar reports that TH was a contact of Detective Inspector Alec Eist, whom Mr. Lashmar describes by reputation the most corrupt yard officer of the 1950s to mid-1970s. The journalist Duncan Campbell described Detective Alec Eist as one of the most active bent police officers from the 1950s to 1970s. In May of 1971, the owners of the leather goods shop Lassac at 189 Baker Street, 2 doors down from the bank, sold the lease of the property for £10,000 to Benjamin Wolfe, a 64-year-old seller of ornaments and knickknacks, and contact of several gang members. The property had a basement that, the group calculated, was at the same level as the bank's vault. Roadworks nearby meant the trembler alarms in the vault floor were turned off after several false alarms as a result of those roadworks. A member of the local security company alerted the gang of the timing and the digging of the roadworks being done, and when the alarms would be turned off. Work began on the tunnel on the Friday evening of August Bank Holiday in 1971, and continued until 10th of September 1971. To avoid being overheard, they dug only during the weekends. Mr. Gavin led the digging of the tunnel from Lassac to under the floor of the vault. Mr. Gavin later said that he had lost 2 stone in the process. The entry hole Mr. Gavin and Mr. Tucker and a 3rd gang member created in Lassac was 15 inches wide and through 6 inches of concrete. Mr. Gavin dug until he reached the walls of the Chickens Inn basement, then dug down and continued under the building using their basement floor as the roof of the tunnel. The tunnel was 40 feet long when finished, and at the end, under the vault, the gang created a cavity 7 by 4 feet. The digging created 8 long tons of waste, which was hauled back to Lassac and dumped towards the rear of the premises. The tunnel, which needed no supports, was later described in court as a magnificent piece of engineering. The gang began their entry into the vault on Friday the 10th of September after the bank closed for the weekend. The gang placed the lookout man on a rooftop overlooking the bank and kept in contact by using walkie-talkies. Their intention was to use the 100-ton jack to force a hole in the 3-foot thick reinforced concrete floor, and railway sleepers were laid on the floor to support it. What the gang did not know was that there was an old well under where the tunnel ended, and the pressure of the jack pushed the bottom of their tunnel down into the well rather than raising the vault's floor upwards. The gang then used the thermic lance in an attempt to cut through the floor. When this failed, they drilled holes in the underside of the vault floor and then packed them with gelignite. On Saturday, the gang coordinated the blast of the explosives with the movement of traffic in the area to mask any noise from those explosives. A 12-inch wide hole was blasted through the floor and into the vault. The tunnel was cleared of the debris created, and the hole was widened with a hammer and chisel. By the time the gang had finished, the exit of the tunnel measured 12 by 14 inches. At around 11 PM on Saturday the 11th of September, Robert Rowlands, an amateur radio enthusiast living in a flat in Wimpole Street, half a mile away from the Lloyd's branch, picked up the walkie-talkie conversations of the gang in error. Mr. Rowlands heard comments over the radio that made him think a local cigarette shop was being burgled. At 11:30 PM, Mr. Rowlands phoned the police, and the local police officer thought it was a prank call at first, and told Mr. Rowlands that he should record the conversation, and if anything interesting was overheard, he should contact them back. Mr. Rowlands thought that was a good idea, and so used a small cassette recorder to make a record of the conversations with the gang members. At around midnight, he recorded dialogue between the gang inside the shop and nearby the lookout about their need to take a break. The first voice said, "Right, well listen carefully, we want you to mind for 1 hour from now until approximately 1 o'clock and then go off the air, get some sleep and come on the air with both radios at 6 o'clock in the morning." The second voice said, "I suggest we carry on tonight mate and get it done with." The first voice said again, "Look, the place is filled with fumes and we were cutting. If the security comes in and smells the fumes, we are all going to have to stop and none of us have got anything. Whereas this way, we've all got 300 grand to cut up when we come back in the morning, and at least we have got something for our efforts." The disagreement between the lookout and the gang continued for a while, and the lookout said, "Money may be your god, but it's not mine, and I'm fucking off." Eventually, after input from a woman's voice and a fourth person who seemed to carry more sway than the others, the lookout agreed to remain on the roof overnight. The lookout man was also given an update on the progress they had made in opening the safety deposit boxes. "We have done 90% of the easy ones, we now face the hard ones," they said. At 2 AM, Mr. Rowlands decided he'd had enough material recorded to call the police again. He did not recontact his local station, but phoned Scotland Yard directly. Scotland Yard sent members of the flying squad to listen to the tapes, and they confirmed that they thought a burglary was taking place. The officers stayed with Mr. Rowlands until about 8:30 AM on Sunday the 12th of September, when the gang returned to the shop and used a radio to contact the lookout. One of the gang members in the shop thanked the lookout for staying on the roof all night and informed him that they planned to finish the job early that afternoon. At one stage in the morning, a waiter from the Chicken Inn restaurant heard noises from within the bank. Naturally curious, the waiter peered through the windows of the Chicken Inn restaurant to see if anything could be seen. Shortly afterward, Mr. Rowlands and listening policemen heard the gang's final radio broadcast. "Would you like to change to the other channel? Over." Mr. Rowlands thought this was code for leaving the bank. Police contacted Baker Street bank staff and local security firms to open up their branches as they began to check 750 banks in an 8-mile radius, and each of the branches was visited by both bank staff and police. They went on to visit the Baker Street branch of Lloyd's at 3:30 PM on the 12th of September. The police and bank staff went on to find the vault secure. They were unable to open the vault to check as it was time locked. It is not known even today if the gang were still in the vault at the time, although police suspect that they were, but keeping quiet following a warning from their lookout. During the burglary, 268 safety deposit boxes were opened, about a quarter of the boxes total in the vault. The gang did not attempt to crack the bank safe though. Lord Hailsham owned one of the boxes in the bank at the time of the robbery, and Mr. Hailsham was Lord Chancellor of the most senior member of the judiciary. Estimates of the amount stolen vary between £150,000 and nearly £4 million. Because of the way the gang communicated, the burglary was soon nicknamed the walkie-talkie job, although the more common name for these events is the Baker Street robbery, but it is legally defined as a burglary. A dictionary of law by the Oxford University Press defines robbery as the offence of using force against any person or putting them in fear of being subjected to force, in order to commit a theft. Burglary is defined as the offence under the Theft Act of 1968, entering a building with the intention of committing one of the 3 specified crimes in it, which include theft. On that morning, bank staff at Baker Street Bank opened the vault and found that they had been burgled. Police found the thermal lamps, walkie-talkies and other tools, including an oxyacetylene torch, in the shop which the gang had left behind. 800 pieces of evidence were logged and forensically examined after the police had collected everything from the scene. Police announced that they were searching for 4 men and a woman. They thought during the burglary that the woman was acting as a controller, based in a different location to the lookout and the gang. The police later widened their search to include 5 other people. The Baker Street Bank provided the police with the names of 260 safety box owners. 8 owners refused to allow their names to be passed on to the police. This could have been due to what was potentially in those boxes in the bank's vault. Up to 120 detectives worked on the case, organising into 4 teams. 1 examining the scene, 1 contacting the known safety box owners, 1 covering the coordination from the control centre, and 1 team dealing with all external inquiries. The police soon identified Mr. Wolf from the lease documents, and within 4 days the police had a list of likely suspects they were investigating. Informers provided the first names of 2 of the gang members and incomplete details of a pub that had been taken over by another gang member. Police made the connection between a newly acquired pub and Mr. Gavin. After several weeks worth of surveillance and investigation, police had identified Mr. Wolf, Mr. Gavin, Mr. Stevens and Mr. Tucker as the key individuals to arrest. But they also wanted to speak to 3 of the 4 people who were believed to be involved in the robbery of Baker Street Lloyd's bank branch. One of those that the police were interested in had been living in France and Italy since October 1971. But there was no extradition treaty agreement in place to request the overseas police to arrange for his return to Britain. Towards the end of October 1971, police surveillance teams saw Mr. Tucker hand over a bag to 2 men, Abdullah Hassan Ganji and his nephew Akbar Muhammad Ali Ganji. Abdullah Hassan Ganji and his nephew Akbar Muhammad Ali Ganji were then arrested and £32,000 of notes were seized. Mr. Wolf, Mr. Gavin, Mr. Stevens and Mr. Tucker was also picked up in the following 2 days and recovered £231,000 that the police had identified as stolen from the vault. After the end of the investigation, Scotland Yard considered prosecuting Mr. Rowlands under the Wireless Telegraphy Act 1967 for listening to unlicensed transmissions, but no charges were ever laid against Mr. Rowlands. Shortly after the case, Lloyd's Bank sent him a cheque for £2,500 to thank Mr. Rowlands for his actions. The 2 Ganjis were remanded into custody until the 16th of November, when bail was set at £75,000. Mr. Tucker, Mr. Gavin and Mr. Stevens were all remanded on bail of £30,000, each on charges relating to the break-in at Baker Street Bank. Shortly afterwards, the Baker Street Bank insurers offered a £30,000 reward for information that would lead to more arrests. The trial of the 4 gang members and the 2 Ganjis opened up on the 2nd of January 1973. Mr. Stevens, Mr. Tucker, Mr. Wolf and Mr. Gavin were charged with breaking into the Baker Street Bank and stealing the contents of the security boxes, valued at a minimum of £1.5 million, and of possessing explosives. The 2 Ganjis were charged with handling stolen goods. Mr. Stevens, Mr. Tucker and Mr. Gavin pleaded guilty. Mr. Wolf and the 2 Ganjis pleaded not guilty to the charges against them. The 2 Ganjis stated that they were acting as a courier for the Swiss-based finance house involved in purchasing sterling. Mr. Wolf claimed that after he signed the lease for Lassac, Mr. Wolf had only returned to the shop once to pick up the post, and that Mr. Wolf was shocked to hear the news about the break-in. The trial ended on the 23rd of January 1973, and the sentences were handed down 3 days later. The 2 Ganjis were found not guilty. Mr. Stevens, Mr. Tucker and Mr. Gavin were each given sentences of 12 years. Mr. Wolf received 8 years, shorter than the others on account of his age at the time. In March 1973, 64 of those whose safety deposit boxes had been broken into went on to sue Lloyds for £500,000. The case opened in the High Court in 1977, by which time there were 138 plaintiffs seeking damages of £660,000. One witness, a retired jeweller, recounted how he identified some of his property by walking around tables on which several items were placed. He and 20 other people were unsupervised while they did this. He noticed a single diamond that could easily have been stolen, which he estimated was worth between £3,000 and £4,000 at the time in 1971's price. Another customer complained that he saw a ring in a waste paper basket. He said it was too easy to steal some of the smaller items if one wanted to, and that one of the bank assistants had told him that 2 people had tried to claim the same pair of candlesticks. 4 days into the trial, the judge visited the bank and the rooms where the property had been on the show. The following day, the judge adjourned the case. No reason was given and no date to resume proceedings was ever set. There have been several rumours circulating about the Baker Street robbery, from the toilet at the New Forge Country Club, a sports and social club in Belfast for serving and retired police officers. The PSNI stated it was a stunt that attempted to divert attention away from the Northern Bank robbery, but the claim is dismissed by Duncan Campbell, who wrote no D-notice was ever requested, far less granted. The journalist Graham McLagan observes that there was a news embargo on a Sunday while the burglary was still in progress, but that the events were widely reported over the following days after. Another rumour is that one of the safety deposit boxes contained compromising photographs of Princess Margaret and the actor and criminal John Bindon. Mr. Campbell describes the story as cheerful nonsense. The club had indeed been taken during the Northern Bank robbery. On the 12th of October 2005, Garda Commissioner Noel Conroy told a law enforcement conference in the In 1976, James Humphreys, a Soho-based pornographer and strip club owner, alleged those police officers had stolen £1 million worth of gems as their share of the burglary. The following year, Commander Bert Wickstead, a senior officer at Scotland Yard, was appointed to head an inquiry into those allegations and the possibility of corruption within the police. In 2011, the Baker Street robbery, a documentary on the burglary, was broadcast on the History Channel. The programme included an interview with Robert Rowlands and the recordings Mr. Rowlands made of the robbery. A fictionalised version of the burglary is subject of the 2008 film The Bank Job, which uses a storyline that the crime was either set up or later covered up by MI5 to secure the compromising photographs of Princess Margaret that were being kept in a safety deposit box at the bank by Trinidadian radical Michael X. The advertising for the film played up many of the rumours, both fueling and reinforcing them. The gang looted safety deposit boxes of cash and jewellery worth millions and millions of pounds. None of it was recovered, nobody was ever even arrested. The film reveals what was hidden in those boxes. The story involves murder, corruption and a sex scandal with links to the royal family. A story in which the thieves were the most innocent of people involved. The 2015 Hatton Garden safety deposit box burglary bears a close resemblance to the break-in at Baker Street. It was headed by Brian Reeder and was carried out over a weekend and involved breaking into a vault containing safety deposit boxes, although in this case the burglars used a heavy-duty drill to enter through a wall. Although many of the records relating to the burglary at the bank were released by the National Archives in 2013, approximately 800 pages of information remain closed. They will become available for viewing in January 2071, 50 years from now. The actions of those involved in the Baker Street robbery have forever left their imprint on the UK criminal underworld, and in 50 years future generations could potentially answer the unanswered questions from their respected robbery of Baker Street Lloyds Bank branch. Please let us know what you think about the Baker Street robbery in the comments below. Thanks for joining us today. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to give it a like and a share, and leave any thoughts or suggestions you have in the comments section. We love to read through them all, and if you're new but enjoy UK true crime content, then subscribe to see when our newest video releases. And as always, stay safe. Hello everyone, welcome to the Street Crime UK YouTube channel. Thank you for joining us. Please don't forget to like, share and subscribe for more content. Today we take a look at the Brink's-Mat robbery and how it became known as the crime of the century by members of the UK criminal underworld. So what is a heist, or more formally known as a robbery? A heist is a theft of cash or valuable objects such as artworks, jewellery, electricals and bullion and more from their respected owners. This can take the form of either a burglary or a robbery. The difference in English and Welsh law being that a robbery uses force, which means that some of the heists commonly known as robberies were actually burglaries. The Brink's-Mat robbery occurred at the Heathrow International Trading Estate, London on the 26th of November 1983. £26 million in 1983 is equivalent in purchasing power to around £89.99 million as of today, 2021, an increase of £63.99 million over 38 years. The pound had an average inflation rate of 3.32% per year between 1983 and today, producing a cumulative price increase of 246%. This means that today's prices are 3.46 times higher than average prices since 1983, according to the Office for National Statistics Composite Price Index. A pound today only buys 28.89% of what it could buy back in 1983, when the inflation rate was just 4.59%. The current year-over-year inflation rate from 2020 to 2021 is now 0.70%. If these numbers hold, £26 million today will be equivalent in buying power to £26 million by 2022. At the time of the Brink's-Mat robbery, £26 million worth of gold bullion, diamonds and cash was stolen from a warehouse. The bullion was property of Johnson Matthey Bankers Limited, which collapsed the following year after making large loans to frauds and insolvent firms to recover the equivalent of what was stolen in bullion. 2 men were convicted, and the majority of the gold has still to this day yet to be recovered. Insurers Lloyd's of London paid out for the losses, and several deaths have been linked to the case of the Brink's-Mat robbery. The Brink's-Mat robbery occurred at 6:40 AM on the Saturday the 26th of November 1983, when 6 robbers broke into the Brink's-Mat warehouse, Unit 7 of Heathrow International Trading Estate, near Heathrow Airport in West London. It was described at the time as the crime of the century. The gang gained entry into the warehouse from security guard Anthony Black. Once inside, the gang members poured petrol over staff and threatened to light them with a lit match, where they would inevitably burn to death if they did not reveal the combination numbers to the vault. The robbers thought that they were going to steal £3.2 million in cash, but they found 3 long tons of gold bullion and stole £26 million worth of gold, diamonds and cash. Two days after the robbery, a couple saw a white-hot crucible operating in a garden hut at a neighbour's property near Bath, Somerset. Suspecting it might be linked to the bullion robbery, they immediately informed the police. The police arrived and were shown the hut, but they said it was just beyond their jurisdiction and said they would pass the information to the police responsible for that area. The couple who called the police initially were never asked to give a statement to the police or give evidence in court. No explanation has been given for the police's failure to follow up immediately on the tip-off. 14 months later, the premises were raided and the furnace was found. The occupier, John Palmer, a local jeweller and bullion dealer, was arrested. In court, Mr. Palmer said he was unaware the gold was linked to the robbery and was cleared of all charges. One of the robbers, Brian Robinson, was caught after a security guard insider, Black, his brother-in-law, passed his name on to investigating officers, and Mr. Robinson was later arrested in December 1983. Scotland Yard quickly discovered the family connection, and Black confessed to aiding and abetting the raiders, providing them with a key to the main door and giving them details of security measures in order to make their entrance and escape as smoothly and problem-free as possible. Mickey McAvoy had entrusted part of his share to associates Brian Perry and George Francis. Brian Perry recruited Kenneth Noy, who was an expert in his field, where Mr. Noy would be able to dispose of the gold. Kenneth Noy melted down the bullion and recast it for sale, mixing in copper coins to disguise the gold source. However, the sudden movement of large amounts of money through a Bristol bank came to the notice of the Bank of England, which went on to inform the police. Kenneth Noy went on to be placed under police surveillance. In January 1985, Kenneth Noy had killed a police officer, DC John Fordham, who he discovered in his garden. At the resulting trial, the jury found Mr. Noy not guilty. Tried at the Old Bailey in December 1984, Mr. McAvoy was sentenced to 25 years imprisonment for armed robbery. Black, Mr. McAvoy's brother, was sentenced to 6 years for his cooperation in the robbery, allowing the gang easier entry and a smoother escape. In 1986, Kenneth Noy was found guilty of conspiring to handle the Brinksmat gold, fined £500,000 plus £200,000 cost, and sentenced to 14 years in prison. Kenneth Noy went on and served 7 years before being released in '94. George Francis was later murdered, and Mr. McAvoy was thought to be a suspect in Mr. Francis's killing. Attempts by Mr. McAvoy to strike a deal to give back his share of the money in exchange for a reduced sentence failed, as by then the money had simply vanished. In January 1995, the High Court ordered Mr. McAvoy to make a payment of £27.4 million, making him responsible for the entire sum stolen in the Brinksmat robbery. Mr. McAvoy went on to be released from prison in 2000. In 1996, Kenneth Noy murdered motorist Stephen Cameron during a road rage incident. Arrested in Spain and extradited, Mr. Noy was convicted of Mr. Cameron's murder in 2000 and received a life sentence. Much of the 3 tons of stolen gold has never been recovered, and 4 other robbers were never convicted. In 1996, about half of the gold, the portion which had been melted and recast, was thought to have found its way back into the legitimate gold market, including the reserves of the true owner Johnson Matthey. According to the BBC, some have claimed that anyone wearing gold jewellery brought in the UK after 1983 is probably wearing Brinksmat gold. On the 21st of December 1983, less than 4 weeks after the robbery, police in Austria arrest 5 men, 4 Italians and an Austrian, at a Vienna hotel. Police also recovered 10 bullion bars bearing the refiner's mark and serial numbers of the bars stolen in the Brinksmat robbery. A person named Gordon Parry laundered large amounts of cash from the robbery after the disposal of the gold, according to the Panama newspapers, which show an offshore financial intermediary firm in Jersey named Center Services requested Mossack Fonseca to set up a Panamanian company 12 months after the Heathrow raid on behalf of an unnamed client. Under Mr. Parry's direction, millions of pounds were put through the resulting Faberian and other front companies via banks in Switzerland, Liechtenstein, Jersey and the Isle of Man. A man identified as depositing £500,000 in cash to the Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank is thought to have been notorious armed robber David Moore. 2 nominee directors from SARK were appointed to Faberian. The company then issued 2 bearer shares. Gordon Parry used the offshore firms and recycled the funds, said to have amounted to £10.7 million, through transactions involving land in London Docklands, some buildings that used to form part of Cheltenham's Ladies' College, a farmhouse in Kent for Mr. McAvoy's girlfriend Kathleen Meacock, and a £400,000 home for himself and his family, Crockham House, near Chartwell, Kent. The Metropolitan Police raided the offices of Centre Services later in 1986, in cooperation with the Jersey authorities. They seized papers and 2 Faberian bearer shares. In 1987, Jürgen Mossack, the law firm's principal, regained control of the company by dilution, and Gordon Parry's appointed a fresh set of Faberian directors, who were instructed to issue 98 new shares to Western Cross Inc., a front company controlled by Mr. Parry or his associates. In 1995, Brinksmat solicitors finally took control of Faberian and its assets. Crockham House was sold and reacquired by Mr. Parry's wife, Irene Beaumont. On the 30th of September 1984, less than a year after the Brinksmat robbery, the banking and gold trading arm of Johnson Matthey Bankers Limited, collapsed and was taken over by the Bank of England to protect the integrity of the London gold markets. Losses amounted to over $300 million at the time. The bank had made very large loans to fraudsters and insolvent businesses over several years, and had serious and unexplained gaps in its records that could not rightfully be explained. The fraud squad was called in and went on to investigate the bank and certain customers the bank had obtained through its years. The so-called curse of the Brinksmat robbery, or curse of the Brinksmat millions, refers to the early deaths of many of those allegedly involved, which makes one wonder, does wealth really solve your issues? These deaths were theorised by members of the London crime underworld as being related to laundering the gold. In 1990, the former treasurer of the Great Train Robbery, Charlie Wilson, had moved to Marbella in Spain, where Mr. Wilson was suspected of being involved in drug smuggling. Engaged to launder some of the proceeds from the Brinksmat robbery, Mr. Wilson lost the investors £3 million, and on the 23rd of April 1990, Mr. Wilson was shot dead. Donald Urquhart was one of the launderers of the proceeds of the Brinksmat robbery. Mr. Urquhart was shot dead in January 1993 on Marylebone High Street in central London. The supergrass Kenneth Regan assisted police with information about Mr. Urquhart's murderer. Graham West was subsequently jailed for Mr. Urquhart's killing, as was Mr. West's accomplice Jeffrey Heath, who had planned the murder of Donald Urquhart. On December 1998, Hatton Garden jeweller Solly Nahome was shot dead outside of his home. Solly was a financier and associate of the Adams family, who were also suspected of being involved in the laundering of Brinksmat gold. Prior to Mr. Nahome's murder, Mr. Nahome's associate and jeweller, Gilbert Winter, had disappeared from the home that Mr. Winter had shared with his girlfriend on the 9th of March 1998. It was theorised that Mr. Nahome and Mr. Winter were murdered as a result of a disappearance of £800,000 from a cannabis deal. While it was suspected that a rival gang murdered Mr. Nahome and Mr. Winter to cause disruption, in mid-2001, Brian Perry was also shot dead. On the 14th of May 2003, George Francis was shot dead by John O'Flynn outside Mr. Francis's courier business in Bermondsey. George Francis was a former associate of the Crays, who was believed to be involved in the laundering of the Brinksmat gold robbery. Mr. Francis has previously survived an attempt on his life when Mr. Francis was shot in the shoulder near a pub that he ran in Essex in May 1985. After allegedly failing to pay £100,000 to have a jury acquit Lenny Teddy Bear Watkins, who was on trial for the murder of Peter Bennett, a customs investigator who was shot by Mr. Watkins in a struggle, on 24th of June 2015, John Goldfinger Palmer was shot dead. The members of the Brinksmat robbery and those who benefited or lost their lives as a result of the quantity stolen will forever be remembered in the UK criminal underworld. Please let us know what you think about the story of the Brinksmat robbery in the comments below. We also have videos on our channel about individual criminals that were connected to the Brinksmat robbery. Thanks for joining us today. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to give it a like and a share, and leave any thoughts or suggestions you have in the comments section. We love to read through them all. And if you're new but enjoy UK true crime content, then subscribe to see when our newest video releases. And as always, stay safe. Hello everyone, welcome to the Street Crime UK YouTube channel. Thank you for joining us. Please don't forget to like, share and subscribe for more content. Thanks for joining us. Today we look at one of the biggest heists that has ever took place in the UK, and how crime groups from all around the world came together to pull off one of the most elaborate robberies ever committed in the UK. The City Bonds robbery that took place in 1990 was a heist in which £291.9 million, equivalent value to £670 million in 2019, was stolen in London, England. The carefully planned operation had made it seem at first as if a courier had been mugged on the 2nd of May. Yet City of London police soon realised that it was a much more sophisticated global venture, which ended up involving participants in the crimes such as the New York Mafia, the Provisional Irish Republican Army, and the Colombian drug barons. The robbery took advantage of the existence of the couriers who moved vast sums of money around the City of London in order to ensure liquidity in the UK financial system. The money was in the form of certificates of deposit and HM Treasury bills. These bearer bonds were recovered in different places, including Glasgow, New York, Miami on their way to Peru, and Zurich. In a wide-ranging investigation, the police eventually recovered all but 2 of the 301 certificates, with some of those arrested allegedly turning informant, such as Mark Osborne, who was later found murdered. Patrick Thomas, who allegedly carried out the original theft, was also shot dead. Keith Cheeseman, an extravagant fraudster, was arrested in the UK but skipped bail to Tenerife claiming his life was in danger. Mr. Cheeseman was briefly thought to have been the bony torso. This was an incident in which the partial remains of an unknown male descendant was discovered in the woods near Bolney, southern England in 1991. However, Mr. Cheeseman was then located and arrested in Spain. Mr. Cheeseman was extradited to the US to stand charges of money laundering and received a 6.5-year sentence for his crimes. John Traynor was arrested for mortgage fraud and using the stolen bonds as collateral. He was sentenced to 7 years for handling stolen goods. He escaped jail after a year and a half, but was arrested in the Netherlands in 2010 and extradited back to the UK to serve the rest of his sentence. This robbery was one of the largest in the world's history. The idea for the robbery was generated by media reports in January 1990 that a courier had accidentally dropped £4 million, equivalent to £9 million in 2019, worth of bearer bonds on their way to the Bank of England. A 23-year-old surveyor had picked up the 4 certificates of deposit on Throgmorton Street, outside the stock exchange, after they had fallen out of the briefcase of a courier working for Rowe and Pitman, a subsidiary of S.G. Warburg & Co. When he gave them back, he was rewarded with a magnum of Laurent Perrier champagne. Upon hearing this story, an organised crime syndicate realised that if a courier was mugged, they could reap a massive haul, since bearer bonds entitle anyone who is carrying them to the money denoted on them. The certificates were issued every week by the Bank of England as a means to manage short-term spending needs, ensuring that there was always liquidity in the financial system. The bills matured after 1 to 6 months and were finally freely traded until the process became electronic in the mid-2000s. Care was taken to make the theft appear to be an opportunistic mugging, since the bonds would be cancelled if it was suspected to have been a heist ordered by an organised crime group. The syndicate planned to launder the bonds as quickly as possible in Zurich. On the morning of the 2nd of May 1990, 58-year-old John Goddard, an employee of financial broker Shepherd's, a subsidiary of Carter Allen, was walking along Nicholas Lane, an alleyway in the City of London. He was carrying 301 certificates, worth £291.9 million, the equivalent to £670 million in 2019, in bearer bonds in a briefcase, of which £121.9 million were certificates of deposit and £170 million were HM Treasury bills. Suddenly a young man in his 20s appeared and mugged Mr. Goddard at knife point. The robber is widely believed to have been Patrick Thomas. At first, it seemed the operation had gone according to plan, despite reports the next day in the Times which declared the heist had gathered a worthless haul and that the perpetrator stands to make not a penny from the crime. The Bank of England was supplying false information to the media on purpose, whilst it had informed the financial institutions worldwide of the serial numbers. The bonds could still be cashed. The Swiss connection was supposed to launder the money, did not work out. Therefore, the criminal syndicate was forced to seek other options in the criminal underworld to try and launder the money. The New York Mafia became interested, since they were already involved in a scheme to launder US bonds in London. The contact man in the UK was Keith Cheeseman, who had previously made false loan applications to support a lavish lifestyle, which included becoming chairperson of Dunstable Town Football Club. Back in 1975, he had been charged with extorting £287,000 and remanded for a week. After arriving at court in a silver chauffeur-driven Rolls-Royce, however, he later received a 6-year sentence for conspiracy to defraud the Beneficial Finance and Loan Society, with 318 fictitious loan applications. Told about the heist, Mr. Cheeseman went to work, liaising with the associates such as Raymond Ketteridge. He sent some of his stolen bonds to Mark Osborne in the US, who then met up with mafioso Tony DiPiano in a New York bar and delivered 10 bonds, each worth £1 million. However, Mr. DiPiano was an FBI agent and Mr. Osborne was arrested, and subsequently realising that he was facing a substantial custodial sentence now, he decided to betray his fellow criminal associates. The FBI had allegedly recorded the conversations between Mr. Osborne and Mr. Cheeseman, until Mr. Osborne disappeared in August 1990 and was later found murdered. The criminal syndicate in London also came to realise that it had also been infiltrated by an informer, since the City of London police had swiftly begun to recover all the stolen bonds. The police had initially hoped the mugging was no more than an accident and the certificates would be found discarded or just turned up somewhere. Yet the evidence built up that it was a sophisticated plan, and thus Operation Starling was set up. Soon they had reports of a bond turning up in Northern Ireland, and someone tried to deposit a bond at a NatWest bank in Glasgow. In summer 1990, 80 certificates worth £77 million were recovered during an allegedly routine check at Heathrow Airport on a flight that was arriving from Dublin. 3 Irish men were arrested, and Customs stated, "We did not know the bonds were coming in, we just found them by pure chance." In fact, the men had been under surveillance, since one of them was Thomas Coyle, a known fence. Mr. Coyle had quickly acquired 80 of the stolen bonds, and realising their enormous value, had recruited John Gilligan and Jim Danger Byrne to help him sell them. Not being able to shift them in Ireland, they devised a plan to sell them to mafia connections in the US via John Francis Conlon, who had connections to various security agencies and arms dealers, such as Monzer Al-Qassar and Oliver North. The plan was sabotaged at the first stage, when Mr. Coyle, Anthony Rooney and Edward Dunn were all arrested at Heathrow. The bonds were discovered in Mr. Rooney's luggage, and all 3 men maintained their innocence. But when the case came to trial at Knightsbridge Crown Court, all 3 were released on technicalities. Mr. Coyle later brought a racehorse which he named 77 mil. Operation Starling retrieved £80 million worth of bonds in Cyprus, and other raids occurring in the Netherlands, Scotland, Singapore and West Germany. A link to the Provisional Irish Republican Army was revealed in September 1990 when a man left a package at the Aero Peru offices in Miami to be delivered to Lima in Peru. A search by US Customs revealed the package contained £71 million in stolen bonds, which the IRA was attempting to trade with the Colombian drug barons in exchange for money and narcotics. The smugglers had hidden the bonds in 2 Miami phone books. Raymond Ketteridge was arrested with another man and charged with handling £70 million in stolen bonds, only to see his prosecution dropped in London in July 1991. He later won his battle of extradition from Cyprus to US in 1994. He had been facing charges of money laundering based on the heist. The police also foiled a mortgage scam which aimed to use stolen bonds as collateral, arresting John Traynor in 1990. Thomas lived on the Turnham Road Council Estate in Brockley, South London, with his stepsister and her family. He presented himself as merely being an ordinary person on the estate, whilst being involved in criminal enterprises such as drug dealing and robbery. When he and David Somerville were caught red-handed cutting up 1 kilo or 2 pounds of cocaine in March 1991, they were remanded to Belmarsh Prison. Then he managed to convince the jury that his co-defendant was responsible for the £30,000 haul of cocaine, and thus was acquitted, while Somerville received a 7-year sentence. Career criminal Jimmy Tippett Jr. writes in his autobiography Born Gangster that Patrick Thomas showed him the bonds in a toilet cubicle soon after robbing Mr. Goddard. Mr. Tippett was arrested in relation to the robbery, but had his charges dropped before court. According to Mr. Tippett, he had been drinking with Mr. Thomas earlier in the evening of the 28th of December, and they then became separated when Mr. Thomas refused to be searched by a bouncer because he was carrying a gun. In the early morning of 29th of December 1991, after hearing a scuffle and a bang on the front door, Mr. Thomas's stepsister found him lying on the ground with a gunshot wound to the head. He died from his injuries as she called for an ambulance. At first, police believed that Mr. Thomas had been killed by friends of Mr. Somerville, but it soon became clear that Mr. Thomas was involved in other serious organised crimes, since he had assorted building society accounts with over £150,000 in them, and he was eventually connected to the bonds robbery as a suspected mugger. Keith Cheeseman was arrested in the UK after an investigation by City of London Police and the FBI. He was sentenced to a 6.5-year term, but somehow managed to flee the country while still on bail. The local newspaper ran a story on the 26th of October 1991, entitled The £290 Million Clue to Headless Corpse, which stated that Mr. Cheeseman had been found decapitated in Bolney, Sussex. However, the bony torso was not Mr. Cheeseman, as he was in fact actually on the run, hiding in Tenerife. A man who had stopped to urinate on his way home after a walk found the body in a wooded area, wrapped up in a carpet with neither head or hands attached to his body. The body was laid to rest in 1994, but then dug up again in 2009 for extended forensic testing, which suggested the man was from Bavaria in Germany, and had spent about a year in the UK before his murder. A German fraudster was identified as living nearby in Haywards Heath at the time, but police investigations have never linked him to the crime in any way. As of today, the corpse, or Bornley torso, is still unidentified. After his arrest in Spain, Mr. Cheeseman was extradited to the United States, where he faced more charges related to a conspiracy to launder £392 million in stolen bonds, including the £292 million that had been obtained in London. Mr. Cheeseman claimed he had skipped bail in fear of his life and pled guilty, admitting that he had processed £16 million in bonds. Judge Robert W. Sweet sentenced him to the maximum available term of 6.5 years because he had attempted to evade justice and also because of his extensive criminal past. Mr. Cheeseman had been involved in another fraud scheme, one in which he had seduced a supervisor of a financial services company. He rented her a luxury apartment, and they conspired to transfer £8 million of the company's money into an offshore account. This was before the two were arrested by the City Fraud Squad. John Traynor escaped a dispute with a dangerous criminal associate, Martin Cahill, in Ireland by moving to England in the late 1980s. Once Mr. Traynor was settled, he then reacquainted himself with an old friend, Mr. James Danger Byrne, who himself was involved in various fraudulent schemes. The two men attempted to join forces with Mr. John Francis Conlon to set up a new venture in which they would attempt to use some of the stolen bonds as collateral investment for a mortgage from a Swiss bank. Mr. Conlon had connections to Miami and presented plans for a fictitious £100 million holiday resort on a Caribbean island. Using bonds with altered numbers, they managed to gain a £200,000 advance in Geneva. Although the bank sent warnings out of their plan to the City of London Police and the Serious Fraud Office. When the courier returned to pick up the rest of the mortgage, the bank told him to wait whilst they sorted everything out, so he called Mr. Traynor and explained what was happening. Mr. Traynor was sitting on a street near Bayswater Road in London waiting. As the courier and Mr. Traynor spoke, the police swooped in on both England and Switzerland in synchronisation. They were both arrested. Mr. Traynor was charged with handling stolen goods and received a 7-year sentence for his part in the crime. Mr. Traynor went to jail in July 1990 and once inside quickly began planning his escape. After a while of being incarcerated and as a reward for good behaviour, he was transferred from HM Prison Wandsworth to HM Prison High Point in Suffolk. Mr. Traynor then requested a temporary home leave to see his family, and when that was granted in November 1992, he immediately took a flight to Dublin and escaped, secure in the knowledge that his offence would not lead to an extradition from Ireland. However, Mr. Traynor was eventually arrested in the Netherlands in 2010 as part of a combined operation by British and Dutch police investigating organised crime across borders. Mr. Traynor was then extradited back to the UK to serve out the remainder of his sentence, but this time under much stricter conditions. The City Bonds robbery is seen as one of the largest heists in history in terms of the amount taken, dwarfing every UK crime such as the UK Brinksmat robbery, the Great Train robbery, the Knightsbridge security deposit robbery, the Northern Bank robbery, and the Securitas Depot robbery. Globally, it is however eclipsed by the 2003 robbery of almost $1 billion, the equivalent to $1.4 billion in 2020, from the Central Bank of Iraq by Qusay Hussein, the son of Saddam Hussein. The police ultimately recovered all but 2 of the 301 certificates that were stolen in the City Bonds robbery. The Bank of England continues to use the bond system to protect financial liquidity, but the last paper bills were produced in September 2003, when the entire process became electronic. The City Bonds robbery and the effects it had will never be forgotten about in the UK criminal underworld. What would you do if you found a piece of paper that was worth millions of pounds? Let us know in the comments below. Thanks for joining us today. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to give it a like and a share, and leave any thoughts or suggestions you have in the comments section. We love to read through them all. And if you're new but enjoy UK true crime content, then subscribe to see when our newest video releases. And as always, stay safe.
Hello and welcome to the Street Crime UK YouTube channel. Please don't forget to like, share and subscribe. Today we look at the Great Train Robbery of 1963. The members of the Great Train Robbery have placed themselves in the minds of the UK criminal underworld. The Great Train Robbery was a robbery of £2.6 million from a Royal Mail train heading from Glasgow to London on the West Coast Main Line in the early hours of the 8th of August 1963 at Brakedow Railway Bridge, Ledburn, near Mentmore in Buckinghamshire, England. After tampering with the line-side signals to bring the train to a halt, a gang of 15, led by Bruce Reynolds, attacked the Royal Mail train. Other gang members included Gordon Goody, Buster Edwards, Charlie Wilson, Roy James, John Daly, Jimmy White, Ronnie Biggs, Tommy Wisby, Jim Hussey, Bob Welch, and Roger Caudry, as well as 3 men known only as numbers 1, 2, and 3, 2 of whom later turned out to be Harry Smith and Danny Pembroke. A 16th man, an unnamed retired train driver, was also present at the time. With careful planning based on inside information from an individual known as the Ulsterman, named possibly erroneously as Patrick McKenna in 2014, the robbers escaped with over £2.6 million. The bulk of the stolen money has never been recovered to this day. Though the gang had not used any firearms, Jack Mills, the train driver, was beaten over the head, which was later known as a metal bar. Mr. Mills was so severely injured that Mr. Mills never worked again. After the robbery, the gang went to hide at the Leatherslade farm. The police later found this hideout. Incriminating evidence led to the eventual arrest and conviction of most of the gang members. The ringleaders of the robbery went on to be sentenced to 30 years in jail. The plan to intercept and rob the overnight Glasgow to London Royal Mail train was based on information from an unnamed senior security officer within Royal Mail. The unnamed senior security officer had detailed knowledge of the amounts of money carried. The senior security officer who was introduced to 2 of the criminals who would carry out the raid, Gordon Goody and Buster Edwards, by a London solicitor's clerk, Brian Field. The raid was devised over a period of months by a core team, Gordon Goody and Ronald Buster Edwards, along with Bruce Reynolds and Charlie Wilson. Bruce Reynolds assumed the role of the mastermind behind the train robbery, later being referred to as the Great Train Robbery of 1963. This gang, although very successful in the criminal underworld, had virtually next to no experience in stopping and robbing trains, so it was agreed to enlist the help of another London gang called the South Coast Raiders, who had the experience the gang needed to pull off the pre-planned train robbery. They enlisted South Coast Raiders, including Tommy Wisby, Bob Welch, and Jim Hussey, who were already accomplished train robbers. The gang called the South Coast Raiders also included Roger Caudry, a man who was a specialist in the train robbery field and knew how to rig the trackside signals to stop the train. Other associates included Ronnie Biggs, a man Mr. Reynolds had previously met in jail, who was added as the organisation evolved and took on more specialist members. The final combined gangs who took part in the raid comprised a total of 16 men. At 6:50 p.m. on Wednesday the 7th of August 1963, the travelling post office train set off from Glasgow Central Station en route to Euston Station in London. The train was scheduled to arrive at Euston at 4 a.m. the following morning of Thursday the 7th of August 1963 and went on to be hauled by English Electric Type 4, which was later named Class 40 Diesel Electric Locomotive D326, which later became 4T126. The train consisted of 12 carriages and carried 72 post office staff who sorted mail during the journey from Glasgow to London. All the mail was loaded onto the train at Glasgow during additional station stops en route to London, and from line-side collection points where local post office staff would hang mail sacks on elevated trackside hooks that were caught by nets deployed by the onboard staff. All of the sort-through mail on the train could be dropped off at the same time. This process of exchange allowed mail to be distributed locally without delaying the train with unnecessary stops to drop individual area mail off. One of the carriages involved in the robbery is preserved at the Nain Valley Railway in Peterborough, England. The second carriage, behind the engine, was known as the HVP High Value Packages Coach, which carried large quantities of money and registered mail for sorting by the Royal Mail staff on board. In 1960, the Post Office Investigation Branch recommended the fitting of alarms to all TPOs with HVP train carriages. This recommendation from the Post Office's Investigation Branch was implemented in 1961, but the HVP train carriages without the alarms were retained in reserve until a later date. The fitting of radios were also considered, but they were deemed to be too expensive at the time, and the measure of fitting radios in the carriages was not implemented. This M30204M carriage was kept for evidence for 7 years following the event and then burned at a scrapyard in Norfolk, in the presence of police and post office officials to deter any souvenir hunters. Just after 3 AM on the 8th of August, the driver, 58-year-old Jack Mills from Crewe, stopped the train on the West Coast Main Line at a red light signal at Sears Crossing Ledburn, between Leighton Buzzard and Cheddington. The signal had been tampered with by the robbers. They had covered the green light and connected a battery power to the red light. The locomotive's second crew member, known as the second man, was 20-year-old David Whitby, also from Crewe. As the signal stop was unexpected at this time and place, Mr. Whitby climbed down from the cab to call the signalman from a line-side telephone, only to find the cables had been cut. Meanwhile, gang members entered the engine cabin from both sides, and as Mr. Mills grappled with one robber, he was struck from behind by another with a kosh and rendered Mr. Mills semi-conscious. The robbers now had to move the train to Bridigo Bridge, which is now known as Mentmore Bridge, approximately half a mile further along the track where the gang had planned to unload the money. One of the robbers had spent 3 months befriending railway staff and to get accustomed to the layout and operation of the trains and carriages. Ultimately though, it was decided that it would be better if the gang used an experienced train driver to move the locomotive and the first 2 carriages from the signals to the bridge after uncoupling the Royal Mail carriages containing the rest of the sorters and the ordinary mail. On that night, the gang hired a new train driver, an acquaintance of Ronnie Biggs, later referred to as Stan Agate or Peter, was unable to operate this new type of locomotive. Although having driven older or different trains for many years, Mr. Biggs was then retired and was experienced only in shunting locomotives on the southern region. With no alternatives available to the gang, it was quickly decided that Mr. Mills would have to move the train to the stopping point near the bridge, which was indicated by a white sheet stretched between poles on the track at the time. Mr. Biggs' only task was to supervise Mr. Agate's participation in the robbery, and when it became obvious that Mr. Agate was not able to drive the train, Mr. Agate and Mr. Biggs were sent to the waiting truck to help load the mailbags. The train was stopped at Bridigo Bridge and the robbers' assault force attacked the HVB Royal Mail carriages. Frank Dewhurst was in charge of 3 other postal workers, Leslie Penn, Joseph Ware and John O'Connor, in the HVP carriages. Thomas Kett, assistant inspector in charge of the train from Carlisle to Houston, was also in the carriage. Both Mr. Dewhurst and Mr. Kett were hit with koshes when they made a vain attempt to prevent the robbers storming the carriage, knowing what was about to go down. Once the robbers had entered the carriage, the staff could put up no effective resistance and there was no police officer or security guard on board to assist the staff on the train. The staff was made to lie face down on the floor in a corner of the carriage. Mr. Mills and Mr. Whitby were then brought into the carriage, handcuffed together and put down beside the staff in the carriage. The robbers removed all but 8 of the 128 sacks from the HVB carriage, which they transferred in about 15 to 20 minutes to the waiting truck by forming a human chain to pass down the 128 sacks. The gang then departed in their Austin Lodestar truck some 30 minutes after the robbery had begun, and to mislead any potential witnesses, they used 2 Land Rover vehicles, both of which bore the registration plates BMG 757A. The gang then headed along less popular roads, listening for police broadcasts on a VHF radio. The journey taking somewhere between 45 minutes to an hour, and arrived back at the Leather Slade farm at around 4:30, at around the same time as the first reports of the crime were being made. Leather Slade farm was a rundown farm 27 miles from the crime scene, between Oakley and Brill, Buckinghamshire, England. It had been brought out 2 months earlier as their hideout. At the Leather Slade farm, they counted the proceeds of the 128 sacks and divided it into 16 full shares and several drinks, which meant smaller sums of money intended for associates of the gang. The precise amount of the split between all associates and the gang members differs according to the source, but the full shares came to approximately 150,000. each equivalent to £3.2 million at today's valuation. From listening to their police-tuned radio, the gang learned that the police had calculated they had gone to ground within a 30-mile radius of the crime scene, rather than dispersing with their haul at the scene. This declaration was based on the information given by a witness at the crime scene in the train carriage the gang had robbed, who had stated that a gang member who had told the post office workers not to move for at least half an hour. The press had interpreted this information as a 30-mile radius, a half-hour drive in a fast car. The gang realised the police were using a dragnet tactic, and with help from the public, this would probably result in discovering the farm much sooner than the gang originally anticipated. A dragnet is a system of coordinated measures for apprehending criminals or suspects, including road barricades, traffic stops, widespread DNA tests, and general increased police awareness. As a result, the plan for leaving the farm was brought forward to Friday from the previous Sunday, when the crime was committed on the previous Thursday. The vehicles they had driven to Leather Slade Farm could no longer be used because they had been seen by the train staff. Brian Field came to the farm on the Thursday to pick up his share of the loot and to take Roy James to London to find an extra vehicle. Bruce Reynolds and John Daly picked up cars, one for Jimmy White and the other for Reynolds, Daly and Biggs, and the replacement train driver. Mr. Field, his wife Karen, and his associate Mark brought the vans and drove the remainder of the gang to the Fields' home to recover. Mr. Field had arranged with Mark to carry out a comprehensive cleanup and set fire to the farm after the robbers had left, even though the robbers had already spent much time wiping down to be free of any prints, and as a precaution, Mr. Field still went ahead and requested that Mark do a deeper clean and then set fire to the Leather Slade Farm. According to Buster Edwards, Mr. Field nicked 10,000 in 10-shilling notes to help pay for Mark's drink. However, on Monday, when Charlie Wilson rang Brian Field to check whether the farm had been cleaned, he did not believe that Mr. Field's assurances that the Leather Slade Farm was in fact clean. Mr. Wilson called a meeting with Mr. Edwards, Mr. Reynolds, Mr. Daly and Mr. James as they agreed that they needed to be sure. The group then went on to call Mr. Field to a meeting on the following Tuesday, where Mr. Field was forced to admit that he had failed to set fire and burn down the Leather Slade Farm. In the IVS 2012 documentary film The Great Train Robbery, Nick Reynolds, son of Bruce Reynolds, said the guy who was paid to basically go back to the farm and burn it down did a runner. Mr. Wilson would have killed Mr. Field there and then, but was restrained by other gang members. By the time they were ready to go back to the Leather Slade Farm, however, they learned that police had found the hideout already, so they would not go back without risking being found and arrested. There is uncertainty regarding the exact cash total stolen from the train robbery in 1963. 2.6 million is a figure quoted in the press, although the police investigation states the theft as 2,595,997 and 10 shillings in 636 packages contained in 120 mail bags, the bulk of the haul in £1 and £5 notes, both of which were older white note and the newer blue note, which was half its size. There was also 10-shilling notes and Irish and Scottish money in the 120 mail bags. Because a 30-minute time limit had been set by Mr. Reynolds, 8 of 128 bags were not stolen and were left behind by the gang. Statistically, this could have amounted to 131,000 or 4.7% of the total that was robbed from the Royal Mail train that day. It is alleged that the total weight of the bags removed was 2.5 tonnes, according to former Buckinghamshire police officer John Woolley. Famously, the gang had used the stolen cash as money in a game of Monopoly while held up at the Leather Slade Farm. The robbers had cut all the telephone lines in the vicinity of the Royal Mail train, but one of the railmen left on the train at Sears Cross and caught a passing goods train in Cheddington, where he raised the alarm at around 4:20. The first reports of the robbery were broadcast on the VHF police radio, and within a few minutes this is where the gang heard the line, "A robbery has been committed and you'll never believe it. They've stolen the train." The gang consisted of 17 members who were to receive an equal share, including the men who were at the robbery and 2 key informants the gang had used to pull the robbery off. The gang that carried out the robbery consisted of 15 criminals, predominantly from South London. They were Gordon Goody, Charlie Wilson, Buster Edwards, Bruce Reynolds, Roy James, John Daly, Roger Caudry, Jimmy White, Bob Welch, Tommy Wisby, Jim Hussey, and Johnny Biggs, as well as Harry Smith and Danny Pembroke, who were never charged due to the lack of evidence against them, and one still unknown, plus the train driver they nicknamed Pop. The best known member of the gang, Mr. Biggs, had only a minor role: to recruit the train driver. Bruce Richard Reynolds was born on the 7th of September 1931 at Charing Cross Hospital, Strand, London, by Thomas Richard and Dorothy Margaret. Mr. Reynolds' mother died in 1935, and Mr. Reynolds had trouble living with his father, Thomas Richard, and his stepmother, so Mr. Reynolds often stayed with one or other of his grandmothers because Mr. Reynolds and his stepmother did not get along. Mr. Reynolds was jailed for 3 years on several counts of breaking and entering, and upon Mr. Reynolds' release, quickly started re-offending. Mr. Reynolds soon joined a gang with best friend John Daly, who would later become Mr. Reynolds' brother-in-law. They were mentioned by South West gang leaders Ernie Watts and Terry Hogan, aka Harry Booth. After the train robbery, Mr. Reynolds escaped to Mexico with his wife Angela and young son Nick Reynolds, who later became a member of the band Alabama 3, whose song "Woke Up This Morning" was the opening theme of The Sopranos, and lived lavishly with his share of the take, approximately £150,000, which was a lot of money back in the 1960s. When the money ran out, Mr. Reynolds moved his family to Canada and then France under false identities, in search for work before returning to the United Kingdom to pursue opportunities promised by Mr. Reynolds' old criminal contacts. Mr. Reynolds was later arrested in 1968 in Torquay and sentenced to 25 years in jail, but went on to be released a decade later due to good behaviour. Mr. Reynolds was then sent back to prison in the mid-1980s for dealing amphetamines. Mr. Reynolds has produced occasional journalism pieces, been a consultant on a movie and book projects about the train heist, and published a well-regarded crime memoir, Crossing the Line, the autobiography of a thief, 1995. In a 2003 interview, Mr. Reynolds recalled, "From an early age, I always wanted a life of adventure, which subsequently led him to a life of crime." Mr. Reynolds was rejected by the Royal Navy because of poor eyesight, and then tried to become a foreign correspondent, but Mr. Reynolds' high achievement in that vein was to become a clerk at the Daily Mail. While Mr. Reynolds' life in crime did provide excitement, Mr. Reynolds said in 2003, "I've always felt that I can escape my past, and in many ways, I feel that it is more like a line from the ancient mariner, and that notoriety was like an albatross around my neck." Mr. Reynolds died, aged 81, on the 28th of February 2013 after a brief illness. Authorities regarded Douglas Gordon Goody as the mastermind of the operation to the robbery of the Royal Mail train. Mr. Goody first made contact with the Ulsterman in a meeting set up by Brian Field in Finsbury Park. Of Northern Irish descent, Mr. Goody was born in Putney, London in March 1930 and was still living in his mother's flat at the time of the train robbery. In the early 1960s, he joined Buster Edwards' gang and helped rob various easy targets. After Mr. Goody's release from prison in 1975, Mr. Goody moved to the whitewashed town of Mallorca in Almeria, Spain, where Mr. Goody ran a tiki beachfront bar. In September 2014, Mr. Goody claimed the identity of the Ulsterman was Patrick McKenna for the first time in a documentary marking the 50th anniversary of the train robbery. The documentary makers employed Ariel Bruce, a social worker who finds missing family members, to trace Patrick McKenna, who was found to have died some years previously. However, Ariel Bruce was successful in his attempts to make contact with Mr. McKenna's family. This documentary was shown in cinemas and on demand in October 2014. On the 29th of January 2016, Goody died of emphysema at the age of 85. The most dangerous of the great train robbers was the silent man, Charlie Wilson. Mr. Wilson was born on the 30th of June 1932 by Bill and Mabel Wilson in Battersea. Mr. Wilson had friends from childhood: Jim Hussey, Tommy Wisby, Bruce Reynolds and Gordon Goody. Later on, Mr. Wilson sent to meet Ronald Edwards and the young driving enthusiast Mickey Ball and Roy James, who had taken up car theft. From 1948 to 1950, Mr. Wilson was called up for national service, but in 1955, Mr. Wilson married Patricia Osborne and went on to have 3 children. While Mr. Wilson did have legitimate work in his in-laws' grocery shop, Mr. Wilson also was a thief, and his criminal proceeds went into buying shares in various gambling enterprises. Mr. Wilson went to jail for short spells for numerous offences through his younger years. In 1960, Mr. Wilson began to work with Bruce Reynolds and planned to get into what he thought to be the criminal big league. Ronald Christopher Edwards was born on the 27th of January 1932 at Lambeth, London, the son of a regular barman. After leaving school, Mr. Edwards worked hard in a sausage factory where Buster began his criminal career by stealing meat to sell on the post-war black market. During Mr. Edwards' national service in the RAF, Mr. Edwards was detained for stealing cigarettes. When Mr. Edwards returned to South London, Buster ran a drinking club and became a professional criminal. Ronald Buster Edwards went on to get married to June Rose in 1952. Together, Mr. Edwards and Miss Rose had a daughter, Nikki. In Mr. Edwards' final years, he ran a flower store outside Waterloo Station in London. Brian Arthur Field was born on the 15th of December 1934 and was immediately put up for adoption by his parents. Mr. Field served 2 years in the Royal Army Service Corps, seeing service during the Korean War. Although soldiers in the Service Corps were considered combat personnel, they were primarily associated with the transport and logistics of the operations. When Mr. Field was discharged from the military, it was with the leaving his superiors with the expressed feelings that Mr. Fields was a very good character. Mr. Fields later became a solicitor's managing clerk for John Wheater & Co. Although Brian Fields was only 28 at the time of the robbery, Mr. Field was already apparently more preposterous than his boss, John Wheater, as was Mr. Field's nature. Mr. Field drove a new Jaguar and had a nice house, Cadbury, an amalgamum of Karen and Brian Field, with Brian Field's wife at the Bridle Bridge, Whitchurch Hill, Oxfordshire, while his boss owned a battered Ford and lived in a run-down neighbourhood. Part of the reason for Mr. Field's prosperity was that he was not averse to giving Mr. Goody or Mr. Edwards information about Mr. Field's clients, and had in their country houses, making them prime targets for thieves. On one occasion, Mr. Field described the contents and layout of a house near Weybridge where Mr. Field's wife Karen had once been a nanny. Prior to the robbery, Mr. Field had represented Buster Edwards and Gordon Goody in past criminal convictions. Mr. Field had arranged Mr. Edwards' defence when he had been caught with a stolen car and had met Mr. Goody at a nightclub in Soho. Mr. Field was called upon to assist in Mr. Goody's defence in the aftermath of the airport job, which was a robbery carried out on the 27th of November 1962 at the BOAC Comet House, Hatton Cross, London Airport. This was the big practice robbery that the South West Gang had done prior to the later known train robbery as the Great Train Robbery of 1963. Mr. Field was also successful in arranging bail for Mr. Goody and Mr. Wilson at other times. In 2014, Douglas Goody had claimed to journalists that the Ulsterman was Patrick McKenna, and at the time of the robbery, a 43-year-old postal worker living in Salford, Lancashire. Patrick McKenna, who was originally from Belfast, met Mr. Goody 4 times in 1963. Mr. Goody alleged that he found out Mr. McKenna's name only when he saw it written inside his spectacles case that Mr. Goody had forgotten about. It is not known, not even to this day, what became of the shares Mr. McKenna allegedly received, but Mr. McKenna's children were flabbergasted on hearing the claim of their father's involvement in the Great Train Robbery. It was surmised that Mr. McKenna either donated his share to the Catholic Church over the years or had the money from his share stolen. This alleged identification of Mr. McKenna as the Ulsterman has been disputed, not at least because Mr. McKenna himself appears to have had no criminal record or associations, and Mr. McKenna himself died poor. It has been suggested that a known associate of the convicted robbers, Sammy Osterman, was part of the gang, and his Ulsterman nickname was simply the result of mishearing of Mr. Osterman's surname. William Gerald Boll, born the 22nd of October 1913 and died on the 26th of June 1970, an accomplice after the fact of Roger Corddry, was convicted as being one of the robbers, despite playing a role no different from the many other accomplices of the various train robbers in the past. Mr. Ball later died in jail. Leonard Dennis Field, born 1931, date of death is still unknown, helped with the purchase of the Leatherslade Farm hideout, paying the deposit of £5,000 in return for a drink of £12,000. Lenny Field was allowed to think that the plan was to hijack a lorry load of cigarettes. Despite not being in on the robbery, Leonard Field was convicted and sentenced to 25 years. 20 years for conspiracy to rob and 5 years for obstructing justice, which was later reduced to 5. Leonard Field was released from jail in 1967 and went to live in North London. John Denby Wheater, born on the 17th of December 1921, died on the 18th of July 1985, was the employer of Brian Field. Mr. Wheater was convicted and sentenced to 3 years. He later died in Harrogate, near Leeds, aged 63. At 5 a.m, 1963's Chief Superintendent Malcolm Futrell, head of the Buckinghamshire Police Criminal Investigation Department, located at Aylesbury, arrived at the crime scene, where Mr. Futrell supervised evidence gathering. Mr. Futrell then went to Cheddington Railway Station, where the train had been taken, and where statements were taken from the driver and postal workers. A member of the gang had told the postal staff not to move for at least half an hour, and this suggested to the police that their hideout could be within approximately a 30-mile radius from the scene. It appeared from interviews with the witnesses that about 15 hooded men dressed in blue boiler suits had been involved, but little more could be gleaned. By lunchtime of the following day, it became obvious to Mr. Futrell that extra resources were needed to cope with the scale of the investigation, and the Buckinghamshire Chief Constable referred to the case to Scotland Yard. George Hatherell, commander of the C Department, and Detective Chief Superintendent Ernie Millen, head of the flying squad, were initially in charge of the London side of the investigation into the train robbery. They sent Detective Superintendent Gerald MacArthur and Detective Sergeant John Pritchard to assist the Buckinghamshire Police. Police then undertook a major search, fanning out from the crime scene after having failed to find any forensic evidence on the remaining train carriages. A watch was put on the seaports. The Postmaster General Reginald Bevins offered a £10,000 reward to the first person who can give information leading to the apprehension and conviction of the persons responsible for the train robbery. Following a tip-off from a herdsman who used an adjacent field to the Leatherslade farm, a police sergeant and constable called there on the 13th of August 1963, 5 days after the train robbery had taken place. The Leatherslade farm was deserted, but they found the truck used by the gang of the robbers, which had been hastily painted yellow, as well as the Land Rovers. The police also found a large quantity of food, bedding, sleeping bags, post office sacks, registered mail packages, banknote wrappers, and a Monopoly board game that the gang had used while at the Leatherslade farm. It was determined that although the farm had been cleaned for fingerprints, some finger and palm prints presumed to be from the robbers had been overlooked, including those on a ketchup bottle and on a Monopoly set which had been used after the robbery for a game, but with real money to pass the time and keep the robbers entertained. Despite the big breakthrough of the discovery of the Leather Slade farm, the investigation was not going as well as the police would have liked. The London side of the investigation then continued under Detective Chief Superintendent Tommy Butler, who replaced Detective Chief Superintendent Millen as head of the flying squad shortly after Mr. Millen was promoted to Deputy Commander under George Hathrill. On Monday the 12th of August 1963, Detective Chief Superintendent Tommy Butler was appointed to the head of the police investigation of London Connection and quickly formed a 6-man train robbery squad. The Leather Slade farm finally found on the 13th of August 1963, the day after Tommy Butler was appointed the head of the London investigation, the train robbery squad descended on the Leather Slade farm. The breakthrough came when Detective Chief Superintendent Millen met a distinguished barrister in a smoking room at an exclusive West End club who told Mr. Millen that someone was willing to inform on the gang. The process of talking to the informer was handled by Mr. Hathrill and Mr. Millen, and they never divulged the identity of the informer to the detectives in their command. The informant had been jailed in a provincial prison just before the train robbery and was hoping to get a parole and other favours from taking and providing information about the train robbery to the police. The informant also clearly did not know all the names perfectly, and a second informant, a woman, was able to fill in the gaps. Mr. Millen said in his book, Specialist in Crime, the breakthrough with the informer came at the moment when I and my colleagues at the yard were in a state of frustration, almost approaching despair. This process saw them get 18 names to be passed on to detectives to match up with the list being prepared from fingerprints collected from the Leather Slade farm where the robbers had stayed temporarily after the robbery. Mr. Hathrill and Mr. Millen decided to publish photos of the wanted men, despite strong protests from Tommy Butler and Frank Williams. This resulted in most of the robbers going to ground. Tommy Butler was a shrewd choice to take over the flying squad and in particular the train robbery squad. Mr. Butler became arguably the most renowned head of the flying squad in its entire history. Mr. Butler was known variously as Mr. Flying Squad, as One Day Tommy for the speed which he apprehended criminals, and as the Grey Fox for his shrewdness. Mr. Butler was also Scotland Yard's most formidable thief-taker, and, as an unmarried man who still lived with his mother, Mr. Butler had a fanatical dedication to his job. Mr. Butler worked long hours and expected all members of the squad to do the same. The flying squad later had to work out rotations whereby one member would go home to rest, otherwise they were getting only 3 hours of sleep per night and had no time to eat healthily or see their families. When the squad tried to get Mr. Butler to ease the working conditions, Mr. Butler was enraged and threatened to send them back to their normal duties if they could not handle his expectations for them. Mr. Butler was said to be very secretive, with Jack Slipper claiming in his book Slipper of the Yard 1981 that Mr. Butler wouldn't even tell his own left hand what the right was doing. This meant that the train robbery squad members were often dispatched on errands with no knowledge of how their tasks fit into the overall investigation. The 6-man train robbery squad consisted of Detective Inspector Frank Williams, Detective Sergeant Steve Moore, Detective Sergeant Jack Slipper, Detective Sergeant Jim Neville, Detective Sergeant Lou Van Dyke, and Detective Constable Tommy Thorburn. The senior officer, Frank Williams, was known to be quite the quiet man. Mr. Williams' speciality was dealing with informants, and he had the best working knowledge of the South London criminal fraternity in the force. One of the squad members, Jack Slipper, would later become head of the flying squad and would still be involved in the case many years later. The Post Office Investigation Branch had to establish the amount of money stolen, £2.5 million and 10 shillings. The branch also sought to identify what money had been taken so that the relevant banks could be notified. Deficiencies in HVP carriage security were reported and secure carriages were immediately brought back into service. The installation of radios was recommended as a priority. The investigation was detailed in a report by Assistant Controller Richard Yates that was issued in May 1964. The first gang member to be caught was Roger Caudry. Mr. Caudry was his friend, William Ball, who was helping him lie low in return for the payment of old debts Mr. Ball owed. They were living in a rented, fully furnished flat above a florist shop in Wimborne Road, Moordown, Bournemouth. The Bournemouth police were tipped off by Ethel Clark, who unfortunately, Mr. Ball and Mr. Caudry was the widow of a former police officer. When Mr. Ball and Mr. Caudry paid rent for a garage in Tweedle Road, off Castle Lane West, 3 months in advance, all in used 10-shilling notes. Mr. Ball was not involved in the robbery, but was sentenced to 24 years and later died in prison in the 1970s. The police later acknowledged that Mr. Ball was the victim of a miscarriage of justice. Other arrests followed. 8 of the gang members and several associates were caught. The other arrests were made by Sergeant Stan Davis and Probationary Constable Gordon Charlie Case. On Friday the 16th of August 1963, 2 people had decided to take the morning stroll in Dorking Woods, discovered a briefcase, a holdall, and a camel bag, all containing money. They called the police, who also discovered another briefcase full of money in the woods. In total, a sum of £100,000 was found. They also found a camel skin bag with a receipt inside from the Café Pension restaurant, Sonnenbüttel, Hindenland, Prov, Germany. It was made out to Hurt and Frey Field. Surrey police delivered the money and the receipt to Mr. Futrell and Mr. MacArthur in Aylesbury, who both knew by then that Mr. Brian Field was a clerk at Mr. James and Mr. Wheater, who had acted on the purchase of the Leatherslade farm. They quickly confirmed through Interpol that Brian and Karen Fields had stayed at the pension Sonnenbüttel in the February of that same year. The police knew that Mr. Field had acted for Gordon Goody and other known criminals. Several weeks later, the police went to Mr. Field's house to interview him. Mr. Field calmly, for someone whose relatives had dumped a large part of the loot, provided a cover story that implicated Lenny Field as the purchaser of the Leatherslade farm and his boss, John Wheater, as the lawyer. Brian Field admitted to visiting the Leatherslade farm on one occasion with Lenny Field, but said Lenny assumed it was an investment of his brother Alexander Field, whom Brian Field had defended unsuccessfully in a more recent crime case. Brian Field, not knowing the police had found a receipt, readily confirmed that he and his wife had been to Germany on a holiday and gave them details at the place at which they stayed. On the 15th of September 1963, Brian Field was arrested and his boss, John Wheater, was arrested 2 days later. Brian's brother, Lenny Field, had already been arrested on the 14th of September 1963. Jack Slipper was the primary of one involved in the capture of Roy James, Johnny Biggs, Jim Hussey and John Daly. The trial of the robbers began at Aylesbury Assize, Buckinghamshire on the 20th of January 1964. Because it would be necessary to accommodate a large number of lawyers and journalists, the existing court was deemed too small, and so the offices of Aylesbury Rural District Council were specially converted for the event. The defendants were brought to the court each day from Aylesbury Prison in a compartmentalised van, out of view of the large crowd of spectators that would arrive, and crowd of the surrounding areas for peaks of the gang members arrested. Mr. Justice Edmund Davies presided over the trial, which lasted 51 days and included 613 exhibits and a total of 240 witnesses. The jury retired to the Grange Youth Centre in Aylesbury to consider the evidence and come up to an agreed upon verdict. On the 11th of February 1964, there was a sensation when John Daly was found to have no case to answer. Mr. Daly's counsel, Walter Rayborn QC, claimed that the evidence against his client was limited to his fingerprints being on the Monopoly set found at the Leatherslade farm, and the fact that he went underground after the robbery. Walter Rayborn QC went on to say that Mr. Daly had played the Monopoly game with his brother-in-law, Bruce Reynolds, early in 1963, and that Mr. Daly had gone underground only because he was associated with people who were publicly sought by the police. This was not proof of involvement in a conspiracy, however. The judge agreed, and the jury was redirected to acquit Mr. Daly of the charges against him. Detective Inspector Frank Williams was shocked when this occurred because, owing to Tommy's butler refusal to share information, Detective Inspector Frank Williams had no knowledge of the fact that Mr. Daly's prints were on the Monopoly set. If Mr. Williams had known this, he could have asked Mr. Daly questions about the Monopoly set and robbed him of his very effective alibi. Mr. Daly was clever in avoiding having a photo taken when he was arrested until he would want to shave his beard first. This meant that there were no photos to show the length of Mr. Daly's facial hair had gotten before Mr. Daly had the chance to change his bearded appearance. No action was taken against Mr. Butler for his mistake in ensuring the case against Mr. Daly was more thorough. On the 15th of April 1964, the proceedings ended with the judge describing the robbery as a crime of sordid violence inspired by vast greed, and passing sentences of 30 years imprisonment on 7 of the robbers. The 11 men sentenced all felt aggrieved at the sentences handed down on them, particularly Bill Bowl, who later died in prison, and Lenny Field, who was later found not guilty of the charges against them. The other men, aside from Mr. Wheater, resented what they had considered to be excessive length of the sentences, which were longer than any of those given to many murderers or armed robbers at that time. Train robbers who were sentenced later and by different judges received shorter terms than those of the Royal Mail train robbery. The severity of the sentences handed down to the robbers caused much surprise. When mastermind Bruce Reynolds was arrested in 1968, Mr. Reynolds allegedly told arresting officer Tommy Butler that those sentences Mr. Reynolds had received had detrimental effects. According to the arresting officer of the train robbers, Tommy Butler, gang leaders had prompted criminals generally to take guns with them when they were sent out on robberies. On the 13th of July 1964, the appeals by Lenny Field and Brian Field, no relation, had the charges of conspiracy to rob were allowed by the court. This resulted in their sentences being in effect reduced to only 5 years. On the 14th of July 1964, the appeals by Roger Corddry and Bill Bowl were allowed, with the convictions for conspiracy to rob quashed, leaving only the receiving charges. Justice Fenton Atkinson concluded that a miscarriage of justice would result if Mr. Bowl's charges were upheld, given that Mr. Bowl's age, physique and temperament made him an unlikely train robber. Luckily for Mr. Bowl, as the oldest robber, Mr. Corddry was also deemed to not be guilty of the conspiracy because his prints had not been found at the Leatherslade farm. Lenny Field was only reluctantly acquitted of the robbery by the judge. Justice Atkinson stated that he would not be surprised if Lenny Field were part of the conspiracy and one of the robbers. The charges against the other gang members were upheld. On the 12th of August 1964, Mr. Wilson escaped from Winson Green Prison in Birmingham in under 3 minutes, the escape being considered unprecedented in that a 3-man team had broken into the prison to extradite Mr. Wilson out. Mr. Wilson's escape team was never caught, and the leader, nicknamed Frenchie, had disappeared from the London criminal scene by the late 1960s. 2 weeks after Mr. Wilson's escape, he was in Paris for plastic surgery. By November 1965, Mr. Wilson was in Mexico City visiting old friends Bruce Reynolds and Buster Edwards. Mr. Wilson's escape was yet another dramatic twist in the train robbery saga. 11 months after Mr. Wilson's escape, in July 1965, Mr. Biggs escaped from Wandsworth Prison 15 months into his sentence. A furniture van was parked alongside the prison walls and a ladder was dropped over the 30-foot high wall into the prison during outside exercise time, allowing 4 prisoners to escape, including Mr. Biggs. The escape was planned by recently released prisoner Paul Seaborn with the assistance of 2 other ex-convicts, Ronnie Leslie and Ronnie Black, with support from Mr. Biggs' wife, Charmaine. The plot saw 2 other prisoners interfere with the warders and allow Mr. Biggs and friend Eric Flower to escape beyond the prison walls. Paul Seaborn was later caught by Officer Butler and sentenced to 4.5 years. Ronnie Leslie received 3 years for being the getaway driver. The 2 other prisoners who took advantage of Mr. Biggs' escape were captured after just 3 months. Mr. Biggs and Eric Flower paid a significant sum of money to be smuggled to Paris for plastic surgery, thus to prevent being captured. Mr. Biggs said he had to escape because of the length of the sentence and what he alleged to be the severity of the prison conditions. Jimmy White with the other robbers on the run, and having fled to the country, only Mr. White was at large in the United Kingdom. Mr. White was a renowned locksmith and thief and had already been on the run for 10 years before the train robbery had taken place. Mr. White was said to have a remarkable ability to be invisible, to merge with his surroundings and become the ultimate Mr. Nobody. Mr. White was also a wartime paratrooper and a veteran of Arnhem. According to Piers Paul Reed in his 1978 book, The Train Robbers, Mr. White was a solidarity thief not known to work with either firm. Mr. White should have a good chance of remaining undetected altogether. Yet was known to be one of the train robbers almost straight away, first by other criminals and then by police. Mr. White was unfortunate in that Brian Field's relatives had dumped luggage containing £100,000 only a mile from the site where Mr. White had brought a caravan and hidden an additional £30,000 in a panelling of that caravan. In addition, a group of men purporting to be from the flying squad broke into Mr. White's flat and took a briefcase containing £8,500. Throughout Mr. White's 3 years on the run with his wife Cherie and baby son Stefan, he was taken advantage of or let down by friends and associates quite often. On April 10, 1996, a new friend recognised Mr. White from photos in a newspaper and informed the police. They went on to arrest Mr. White at Littlestone while he was at home. Mr. White was found to have £8,000 to hand back to the police. The rest was gone. Mr. White was tried in June 1966 at Leicester's Assizes, and Mr. Justice Neild sentenced him to 18 years in jail, considerably less than the 30 years given to the other principal offenders at the time. Buster Edwards. Mr. Edwards fled to Mexico with his family to join Bruce Reynolds and later Charlie Wilson, but returned voluntarily to England in 1966, where Mr. Edwards was sentenced to 15 years in jail. Charlie Wilson. Mr. Wilson took up residence outside Montreal, Quebec, Canada, on Rigurd Mountain in an upper middle class neighbourhood where the large, secluded properties are surrounded by trees. Mr. Wilson lived under the presumed name of Ronald Alloy, a name borrowed from a Fulham shopkeeper. Mr. Wilson's wife and 3 children soon joined him in Montreal, Quebec, Canada. Mr. Wilson joined an exclusive golf club and participated in activities of the local community. It was only when Mr. White invited his brother-in-law over from the UK for Christmas that Scotland Yard was able to track him down and recapture Mr. White on outstanding warrants. Scotland Yard waited 3 months before making their move, in the hope that Mr. Wilson would lead them to Mr. Reynolds, the last suspect to be apprehended. Mr. Wilson was arrested on the 25th of January 1968 by Tommy Butler. Many in Rigulad pensioned that Mr. White's wife and 3 daughters be allowed to stay in the Montreal area of Canada. Bruce Reynolds. On the 6th of June 1964, Mr. Reynolds arrived in Mexico with his wife Angela and son Nick, joining Mr. Reynolds a few months later after they evaded the obvious police surveillance. A year later, in July 1965, Buster Edwards and his family arrived, although unlike Mr. Reynolds' family, they planned to return to England at some stage and did not like living in Mexico. Charlie Wilson, on the run with his family, still back in England, visited them for 6 weeks, so 3 of the train robbers were together in exile for a short period of time. After the Edwards family returned to England, the Reynoldses also decided to leave Mexico and go to Canada to potentially join up with the Wilson family, leaving on the 6th of December 1966. The robbers had spent much of their share of the robbery by this point, living far more extravagantly than the Edwardses had. After realising the danger in settling near the Wilson family in Montreal, they went to live in Vancouver and then went to Nice, France. Mr. Reynolds did not want to go to Australia where Mr. Biggs was, and needed money, decided to go back to England, settled briefly in Torquay before being captured by Tommy Butler. Ronnie Biggs. Ronnie Biggs fled to Paris, where he acquired new identity papers and underwent plastic surgery. In 1970, Ronnie Biggs had moved to Adelaide, Australia, where he worked as a builder, and Ronnie and his wife had a 3rd son. Tipped off that Interpol was showing interest, Ronnie Biggs moved to Melbourne, working as a set constructor for Channel 9, later escaping to Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, after police have discovered Ronnie Biggs' Melbourne address. Ronnie Biggs could not be extradited because there was no extradition treaty between Britain and Brazil at the time, and additionally, Ronnie Biggs became father to a Brazilian son, which afforded him legal immunity. As a result, Ronnie Biggs lived openly in Rio for many years, safe from the British authorities that were out to catch and send him to jail for his outstanding warrant for robbery. In May 2001, aged 71 and having suffered 3 strokes, Ronnie Biggs voluntarily returned to England. Accepting that he could be arrested, Ronnie stated desire to walk into a Margate pub as an Englishman and buy a pint of bitter, despite being wanted by police. Arrested on landing after detention and a short court hearing, Ronnie Biggs was sent back to prison to serve the remainder of his sentence. On the 2nd of July 2009, Ronnie Biggs was denied parole by Justice Secretary Jack Straw, who considered Ronnie Biggs to be still woefully unrepentant, but was released from custody on the 6th of August, 2 days before his 80th birthday, on compassionate grounds. Ronnie Biggs later died on the 18th of December 2013, aged 84. Following the deaths of Mr. Goody on the 29th of January 2016 and Tommy Wisby on the 30th of December 2016, Bob Welsh is the only remaining known member of the gang known to still be alive by this time. In later years, the robbers generally came together only for the funerals of their fellow gang members to pay their respects. Mr. Wilson's funeral on the 10th of May 1990 was attended by Bruce Reynolds, who reported seeing Buster Edwards, Roy James, who got into a verbal argument with the press, Mr. Welsh, who was hobbling on crutches, and Mr. White, who went unnoticed due to his natural ability to blend into the background. At Mr. Edwards' funeral in 1994, Mr. Reynolds claimed to see Mr. Welsh. Mr. Hussey, Mr. Wisby and Mr. James were in prison at this time. After being sentenced on the 16th of April 1964, Brian Fields served 4 years of his 5-year sentence. Brian Fields was later released in 1967. While Brian Fields was in prison, his wife Karen divorced him and married a German journalist. Mr. Fields' wife Karen went on to write an article for the German magazine Stern. Karen confirmed that she took Roy James to Thame railway station so Mr. James could go to London, and that Karen led a convoy of 2 vans back to her house, where the gang was joined by wives and girlfriends for a big party to celebrate the success of the crime they had committed. When Mr. Reynolds returned to the UK in 1968, Mr. Reynolds tried to contact Brian Field, as this was the only way he could get in touch with the Ulsterman. It seems that Mr. Field was ambushed upon his release from prison by a recently released convict, Scotch Jack Buggy, who presumably roughed up or even tortured Brian Field with a view to extorting some of the loot from the robbery for his own greed. Subsequently, Brian Field went to ground and Mr. Buggy was killed shortly after. Mr. Reynolds later gave up trying to find Brian Field. In the mid to late 1970s, Brian and Sian worked for the Children's Book Centre, which has been sold on the Kensington High Street, London. Mr. Field and his wife Sian were responsible for the company's operations in Central and Southern Europe, to where they shipped English language books and held book fairs at international English schools. Brian Field, aged 44, and Sian, aged 28, died in a car crash on the M4 motorway on the 27th of April 1979, a year after the last of the robbers had completed their sentences. This accident occurred as the couple returned from a visit to Sian's parents in Wales. A Mercedes is driven by Amber Bisson, the pregnant 28-year-old daughter of well-known hairdresser Raymond Bisson, and nicknamed Mr. Teasy Weasy, crossed as a damaged section of the guardrail and slammed into Brian Field's oncoming Porsche. The Fields, Amber, and her husband and 2 children were all killed instantly. It was several weeks after the accident that Mr. Fields' true identity was discovered by the police. It is not clear whether his wife Sian ever knew of Brian's past. The last of the robbers released, after serving about 1/3 of his sentence, Mr. Wilson returned to the life of crime and was found shot dead at his villa in Marbella, Spain, on the 24th of April 1990. Mr. Wilson's murder was thought to be related to suspected cheating in the drug dealing game. Mr. Wilson is buried in Steetham Cemetery. Buster Edwards. After he was released, Buster became a flower seller outside Waterloo Station in London. Mr. Edwards' story was dramatised in the 1988 film Buster, with Phil Collins in the title role. Mr. Edwards died in a garage in November 1994, allegedly committing suicide by hanging himself. Mr. Edwards' family continued to run the flower stall after his death. Roy James went back to the motor racing following his release on the 15th of August 1975. However, Mr. James crashed several cars and his chances of becoming a driver quickly faded into a past dream. After the failure of his sporting career, Mr. James returned to the trade as a silversmith. Mr. James produced a trophy given to Formula One promoters each year thanks to his acquaintance with the Formula One founder Bernie Ecclestone. In 1982, Mr. James married a younger woman, but the marriage quickly broke down as the couple seemed incompatible with each other. By 1983, Mr. James and Charlie Wilson had become involved in an attempt to import gold without paying the excise duty. Mr. James was acquitted in January 1984 for his part in the swindle. In 1993, Mr. James shot and wounded his father-in-law, pistol whipping and partially strangling his ex-wife after they had returned their children for a day's outing. This resulted in Mr. James being sentenced to 6 years in jail. In 1996, James underwent triple bypass surgery and was subsequently released from prison in 1997, only to die almost immediately afterwards on the 21st of August after suffering from another heart attack. Mr. James was the 5th member of the gang to die, despite being the youngest. Roger Caudry was the first of the robbers to be released, but Mr. Caudry's share of the theft had almost entirely been recovered by the police. Mr. Caudry went back to being a florist at his sister's business upon his release. Mr. Caudry is now dead, and his son Tony had publicly acknowledged that his dad confirmed that Bill Bowl was innocent of any involvement in the robbery. Bruce Reynolds, the last of the robbers to be caught, was released from prison on the 6th of June 1978 after serving a prison term of 10 years. Mr. Reynolds, then aged 47, was helped by Gordon Goody to get back on his feet before Mr. Goody departed for Spain. By October 1978, day release ended and Mr. Reynolds had to report to a parole officer. Frank Monroe, one of the 3 robbers who was never caught, temporarily gave Mr. Reynolds a job, but did not want to attract undue attention by employing Mr. Reynolds for too long. Mr. Reynolds later got back together with his wife Angela and son Nicholas. Mr. Reynolds was arrested in 1983 for drug dealing offences. Mr. Reynolds denied having any involvement in the robbery. Mr. Reynolds was released again in March 1985 and dedicated himself to helping his wife Angela recover from a mental breakdown. In 2001, Mr. Reynolds and his son Nicholas travelled with reporters from the Sun newspaper to take Mr. Biggs back to Britain. In 2010, Mr. Reynolds wrote the afterword of Signal Red, Robert Ryan's novel based on the robbery, and Mr. Reynolds would regularly comment on the robbery. Mr. Reynolds died in his sleep aged 81 on the 28th of February 2013. John Daly, upon his acquittal and release, and after finding his share of the loot stolen or destroyed, Mr. Daly gave up his life of crime and went straight, putting his past thoroughly behind him. Mr. Daly and his wife Barbara and their 3 children moved to Cornwall, where Mr. Daly worked as a street sweeper until the age of 70, known to locals as Gentleman John or John the Gent. Mr. Daly told no one about the robbery, as he was told he could face a retrial. Mr. Daly died 6 weeks later after his brother-in-law, Mr. Reynolds, had passed away. On the 6th of August 2009, Ronnie Biggs was granted release from prison on compassionate grounds due to a severe case of pneumonia and other ongoing health problems. In 2011, Mr. Biggs updated his autobiography, Odd Man Out, The Last Straw. Having suffered a series of strokes after Mr. Biggs' release and unable to speak for the previous 3 years, Mr. Biggs died at the Carlton Court Care Home, in London on the 18th of December 2013. Tommy Wisby was luckier than most of the others in that his loot had been entrusted to his brothers, and when Mr. Wisby emerged, he had a house in South London and had a few investments to keep himself going. During Mr. Wisby's prison stint, his daughter Lorraine had died in a brutal car accident. Mr. Wisby took a while to learn how to live harmoniously with his wife Renee, his daughter Marilyn having moved out upon Mr. Wisby's return. Shortly after Mr. Wisby's release, Mr. Wisby was imprisoned on remand over a swindle involving travellers' checks. The judge acknowledged the minor nature of Mr. Wisby's role. Jim Hussey was released on the 17th of November 1975 and married girlfriend Jill, whom he had just met before the train robbery. Mr. Hussey's share of the loot had been entrusted to a friend of Frank Monroe, who squandered it despite Mr. Monroe periodically checking on its keeper. Mr. Wisby and Mr. Hussey fell back into crime and were jailed in 1989 for cocaine dealing, with Mr. Wisby sentenced to 10 years and Mr. Hussey to 7 years. In Mrs. Wisby's book, Gangster's Mole, Marilyn Wisby recounts that on the 8th of June 1988, after returning home from a visit to an abortion clinic and resting, they were raided by the drug squad. The raid uncovered 1 kilogram of cocaine and Rennie and Marilyn Wisby was arrested along with Jimmy Hussey, who had been spotted accepting a package from Mr. Wisby in a park. Mr. Wisby himself was captured a year later in Wilmslow, Cheshire. Mr. Wisby was allegedly staying with another woman to the shock of his wife and daughter. In return for Mr. Hussey and Mr. Wisby's pleading guilty, the 2 women were unconditionally freed from their husbands' grips. Upon their release from prison, both men retired from working. Mr. Wisby later explained, "We were against drugs all our lives, but as years went on, towards the end of the 70s, it became more and more of the in thing to do. Being involved in a great train robbery, our name was good. Other criminals knew we had never grasped anyone. We had done our time without putting anyone else in the frame." On the 26th of July 1989, 2 men pleaded guilty and admitted at Snaresbrook Crown Court, London, that they were a part of a £500,000 cocaine trafficking ring. Mr. Wisby's grandson has also had trouble with the law in Cyprus. Bob Welsh, born March 1929, was released on the 14th of June 1976. Mr. Welsh was the last of those convicted in the Aylesbury to be released from prison. Mr. Welsh later moved back in with his wife June and his son. He threatened the man left in charge of his shares of the theft to retrieve the remaining shares. A leg injury sustained in prison forced Mr. Welsh to undergo several operations, which left him disabled. Douglas Goody was released from prison on the 23rd of December 1975, aged 46, and went to live with his ill mother in her small cottage in Putney. Unlike other robbers, Mr. Goody was exceptionally lucky in that the man he left in charge of his affairs was loyal and successful, so Mr. Goody was able to live a relatively well-off lifestyle after leaving prison. In his final years of incarceration, Mr. Goody had taken full benefit of the newly established Education College at Wormwood Scrubs and studied Spanish to GCSE standard. Mr. Goody later moved to Mallorca, southern Spain, where he bought a property and a bar and settled down, believing to be safer to be out of the United Kingdom entirely. Mr. Goody was at one point accused of cannabis smuggling but ultimately cleared of all those wild charges. Mr. Goody continued to live in Mallorca until his death on the 29th of January 2016, following an illness he inevitably could not beat. While there has been a lot of mystery surrounding several of the gang who were not imprisoned, in reality the police knew almost the entire gang almost instantly despite what the public or the news was saying. By the 29th of August 1963, Commander Hatherell had 14 names and told the police that Brian Field had tried to enlist another gang to rob the train, who had turned Mr. Field down. Mr. Hatherell's list was unerringly accurate. All the major gang members who were later jailed were identified except for Ronnie Biggs. With the exception of the minor accomplices, Lenny Field, Bill Bowl and the train driver, the list was complete. although of course the Ulsterman was not identified. In terms of the ones that got away, there were 4 others identified: Harry Smith, Danny Pembroke, a fair-haired man 25 years old and well-spoken, who was not named, and a nondescriptive man who may have been Jimmy Collins. In 2019, Mr. Pembroke's son, also called Danny, confirmed that his father was present during the raid. Mr. Pembroke escaped detection as he always wore gloves, including at the hideout at the Leatherslade farm, and went outside to the toilet rather than using the one inside of the house. The son stated that Mr. Pembroke, whose share of the loot was £150,000, died in 2015, aged 79. Both Piers Paul Reed and Bruce Reynolds refer to 3 robbers who got away as Bill Jennings, Alf Thomas and Frank Monroe. Piers Paul Reed refers to this man as Bill Jennings in The Train Robbers, while Bruce Reynolds adds the nickname Flossie. Ronnie Biggs refers to him as Mr. One, as do other accounts. According to Bruce Reynolds, Flossie had no previous convictions and stayed well out of contact with the group. A shady figure, nobody knew exactly where he lived or even what his real name was. All we knew that he was 100% and was sure to outlast the Hula Baloo. The last report of Flossie, or Mr. One, said that he was in a safe house, banged up with 2 gorgeous girls and enough champagne to sink a battleship. It is clear that while Mr. Reynolds claims to not have known his real name, Flossie was just a participant in the Great Train Robbery. He was a core part of the gang and participated in the London airport robbery. This robbery was the audacious raid that Gordon Goody and Charlie Wilson were acquitted of. The raid consisted of Roy James and Mickey Ball as the getaway drivers, with 6 robbers: Bruce Reynolds, Buster Edwards, Gordon Goody, Charlie Wilson and Flossie, and a 6th man who did not participate in the train robbery. In the end, the only one caught after the airport raid was Mickey Ball, who pleaded guilty to being a getaway driver when a witness mistook him for Flossie, and to avoid being blamed for the actual violence, Mr. Ball agreed to plead guilty as an accomplice and was in prison during the time of the Great Train Robbery. Mr. Ball was found out to have been given £500 from the proceeds of the train robbery. Henry Thomas Harry Smith, born on the 20th of October 1930, is believed to be Flossie, and unlike most other robbers, actually got to spend his share of the loot, buying 28 houses and also a hotel and drinking club in Portsmouth, England. Mr. Smith was the only man not ultimately arrested that was on both the Hatherell list and Tommy Butler's list of criminals to rob the Royal Mail train that day. Danny Pembroke was an ex-army man who was a South London taxi driver and a South Coast raider. At Leatherslade Farm, Mr. Pembroke was the most careful of the gang, and nothing was ever found to associate him with the robbery, despite the police being satisfied that Mr. Pembroke was one of the gang and had searched his house in September 1963. However, afraid that Mr. Pembroke would be betrayed, he did a deal with Frank Williams and paid back a sum of £47,000. Following the robbery, Mr. Pembroke left for America for a couple of years, knowing he was set up for life, and then returned to live quietly in Kent. Mr. Pembroke later died at age 79 from a heart attack, at home, in his sleep on the 28th of February 2015. Mr. Pembroke had 5 children, and his son Danny Jr. admitted to his involvement in the Channel 4 documentary in August 2019. According to Bruce Reynolds, Frank Monroe, who was never caught, worked as a film stuntman for a while before starting a paper and scrap metal recycling business. The driver, of course, was not a member of the gang, as defined by receiving an equal share, more as just an accomplice. Piers Paul Reed called the replacement train driver Stan Agate, and Stan was apparently the true nickname of the replacement driver. Mr. Reed, concerned that the robbers may have hurt him, went to see Ronnie Biggs in Brazil to get his details, although was dismissed to find that Ronnie Biggs did not know his last name and knew and cared very little about him. With the meagre details provided, Mr. Reed used a detective agency to track down the driver at a town 20 miles south of London, and found that the train driver was still alive, although somewhat senile and being cared for by his dear wife. The wife admitted that she had burnt all the clothes that he had worn that night and had nervously waited for either the gang to murder him or the police to arrest him. Mr. Reed promised not to reveal their identities. Unlike the other 3 members of the gang who got away, Peter Fordham does make mention of the replacement driver, but notes that he is said now to be dead. Perhaps the robbers who provided material for the book did not want the police looking for the replacement driver, as at the time of publishing in 1965, Mr. Reynolds, Mr. White and Mr. Edwards were still on the run. Ronnie Biggs, in his 1994 autobiography Odd Man Out, said that Bruce Reynolds offered him a chance to join the gang if Mr. Biggs could find a train driver. Ronnie Biggs offers the train driver a £40,000 share of the profits, tells Mr. Reynolds, and gives his address to John Daly, who then proceeds to check this train driver out. It seems that while he was an older man, the train driver still had to apply for 2 weeks leave of absence from his job. According to Mr. Biggs, Peter was paid his £40,000 drink, although other accounts claim otherwise. Mr. Biggs states that Mary Manson drove Peter and John Daly home, while Mr. Reynolds drove Mr. Biggs home. John Wheater was released from prison on the 11th of February 1966 and managed his family's laundry business in Harrogate, North Yorkshire. Mr. Wheater later wrote 2 articles in the Sunday Telegraph, which published the first one on the 6th of March 1966. Mr. Wheater later died in July 1985. Lenny Field was released in 1967 and went to live in North London. Lenny Fields disappeared from the public eye. Mary Manson, an associate of Bruce Reynolds and John Daly, was charged with receiving £820 from the robbery. Mary Manson was held for 6 weeks but was later released. Mary Manson took care of the wives and children of some of the robbers while they were on the run or in jail. Jack Mills had constant trauma headaches for the rest of his life before dying of leukemia in 1970. Mr. Mills' assailant, who was one of the 3 members of the gang that were never identified by others in the gang. However, in November 2002, Mr. Hussey made a deathbed confession that it was him, although there were suspicions that this was a repayment of a debt to divert the attention from the real perpetrator. Frank Williams, at the time a detective inspector, claimed at least 3 men who were directly involved are still at liberty and enjoying their full share of the money stolen and the profits from the way they invested it, one of them being the man responsible for the attack on the train driver. Frank Williams said that the train driver's assailant was not some phantom figure lurking in the criminal underworld, and that he traced him, identified him and took him to Scotland Yard, where Tommy Butler, Mr. Williams, went on to question him. The train driver could not be charged because of lack of evidence. There were no fingerprints or identifying marks anywhere. None of those arrested informed on this person, although it was claimed that this person had completely disobeyed instructions and used violence during the robbery when told not to. David Whitby, born on the 24th of January 1937, died on the 6th of January 1972, was also from Crewe. Mr. Whitby was traumatised by his trackside assault and subsequently rough treatment and never ever recovered from his ordeal. David Whitby was 26 years old at the time of the robbery. He was able to resume his job as a second man but died from a heart attack on the 6th of January 1972 at the age of 34 in Crewe, Cheshire. Engineer William Gerald Bill Ball, born the 22nd of October 1913, died on the 26th of June 1970, was an accomplice after the fact of Roger Corddry. Mr. Ball was considered so at the time because he knew Mr. Corddry, and moreover was found in Corddry's car where a large stash of stolen money was hidden. Mr. Ball's family are now trying to have his name cleared, as they believe, based on evidence not used in the original trial, that Mr. Ball was at best an accomplice after the fact, with no knowledge of the robbery, and that it was likely that Mr. Corddry told him nothing about the provenance of the cash. Furthermore, both Ronnie Biggs and Gordon Goody, 2 surviving gang members at the time, gave sworn advocates asserting that Bill Ball was innocent. Both gang members stated that they believed Mr. Ball was stitched up by the police. The audacity and scale of the robbery was yet another controversy with which the Conservative government of Harold Macmillan had to cope with. After his success in securing Mr. White and Mr. Edwards, Tommy Butler got the Metropolitan Police Commissioner, Sir Joseph Simpson, to suspend Mr. Macmillan's retirement on his 55th birthday so he could continue to hunt the robbers. This paid off with the arrest of first Mr. Wilson and then Mr. Reynolds. When asked by a reporter after the sentencing of Mr. Reynolds whether that was the end of it, Mr. Butler replied that it was not over until Mr. Biggs was caught. In 1969, Mr. Macmillan was finally forced to accept compulsory retirement and later died in 1970, aged 57. The same day, Mr. Biggs's memoirs were published in the Sun newspaper. Mr. Butler's deputy, Frank Williams, was passed over to be his replacement as the head of the flying squad because Mr. Frank Williams' deal with Mr. Edwards and his deal with another of the robbers who was never caught. Following this, Mr. Williams left the force to become head of security for the airline Qantas. Mr. Williams wrote his autobiography No Fixed Address, which was published in 1973. Jack Slipper of the Metropolitan Police was promoted to Detective Chief Superintendent. Mr. Slipper became so involved in the case that he continued to hunt many of the escaped robbers after he retired. Mr. Slipper believed that Mr. Biggs should not be released after returning to the United Kingdom in 2001, and after he appeared in the media to comment on any news item connected with the robbery before Mr. Biggs' death on the 24th of August 2005 at the age of 81. Detective Chief Superintendent Easton Malcolm Futrell, head of the Buckinghamshire Crime Investigation Department, was born on the 29th of September 1909 and died on the 28th of November 2005, aged 96. Mr. Slipper retired on the last day of the trial after the verdicts were handed down and then compulsory retirement age of 55. This allowed Mr. Slipper with Ronald Payne of the Sunday Telegraph, who was involved in the paper's coverage of the case, to be the first of the investigators to write a book, The Train Robbers, on the robbery investigation of 1964. In the book, Mr. Slipper expressed some frustration with the flying squad, although he mostly had praise for most of the individual officers. Mr. Slipper's one regret was that he had the search for the hideout carried out radiating outwards from the scene of the robbery, rather than an inward search from a 30-mile perimeter. Mr. Slipper worked as an accommodation officer for Portsmouth Polytechnic before retiring to live by the sea near Swanage. Mr. Slipper continued to express disgust at any film that he felt glamorised the robbers. It has been said that Mr. Slipper bore a striking resemblance to John Thaw, who was the star of Inspector Morse, which, perhaps coincidentally, was a television series about a detective in the Thames Valley Police Force, the modern-day successor to Buckinghamshire Constabulary. Mr. Futrell was assisted and later succeeded in the investigation by John Woolley, who served in the Buckinghamshire Constabulary from 1959 to 1984. George Hatherell, alive from 1898 to 1986, had his service extended by 1 year because of the need to complete the investigation of the Great Train Robbery. Mr. Hatherell visited Canada and the US as a lecturer on police matters. Mr. Hatherell died on the 17th of June 1986 at the age of 87. Gerald MacArthur died aged 70 on the 21st of July 1996. Mr. MacArthur was famous for breaking up the Richardson gang at a time when a significant number of London-based detectives were known to be corrupt. One of the post office carriages that were part of the remaining train but not involved in the actual robbery is preserved at the Nene Valley Railway Station at Peterborough, Cambridgeshire, and is being restored. The actual carriage that was robbed, M30204M, was retained for 7 years following the robbery, and then taken to Norfolk and burned in the presence of police and post office representatives at a scrapyard near Norwich in the 1970s. This was to deter souvenir hunters. Locomotive English Electric Type 4, D326, later known as 40126, was involved in a number of serious operating incidents. The locomotive was scrapped at Doncaster Railway Workshops in 1984. The retrieved Monopoly board used by the robbers at the Leatherslade Farm hideout and a genuine £5 note from the robbery are on display at the Thames Valley Police Museum in Sulhamstead, Berkshire. For some years, Network Railway described the location of the robbery as Train Robbers Bridge in their infrastructure records, and a structure identification plate showing this was attached to the bridge itself. This led to an outcry advocating the restoration of the original name of the Bridgego Bridge. In late 2013, Network Rail bowed to public pressure, but this time naming it Mentmore Bridge. The sign was replaced around 2017. £2.6 million was stolen, although the police report states that it was £2.59 million. The bulk of the haul was in £1 notes, £5 notes, both the older white note and newer blue note, which was half its size. The £5 notes were bundled in batches of £2,500, the £1 notes in batches of £500. There were also 10 shilling notes in batches of £250. A quantity of Irish and Scottish money was also stolen. With the exception of a few drinks for associates, the loot was split into 17 equal shares of around £150,000 each. However, George Hathrill claims that there were 18 shares. With a few notable exceptions, the money was quickly laundered or divided by friends, family and associates of the robbers. Much was laundered through the bookmakers. Mr. Wilson and Mr. Wisby were themselves bookmakers, although, astonishingly, only a few £100 were identifiable by serial numbers, so the robbers could have spent the money without fear of being traced as a result of those serial numbers. There were 1,579 notes, whose serial numbers were known, and the rest of the money was 100% completely untraceable. The £5 notes were two different types because in 1957 the British government had begun to replace the large white notes with smaller blue ones that came in the rotation later on. The final changeover had not been completed by the time of the train robbery. The white notes quickly became far more suspicious to use, making it harder for them to be spent. Although within 6 months of the robbery, 10 of the robbers had been locked up awaiting trial, and 3 others were wanted criminals on the run, very little of the money had actually ever been recovered. This has led to speculation that there is a great deal of robbery loot still out there in the market today. In fact, the money was soon seized and spent by predatory gangsters and greedy associates, relatives and lawyers. Thus, the proceeds of the greatest cash robbery in British history were quickly used up, with few of the robbers receiving any real long-term benefit for their efforts. Less than £400,000 was eventually recovered by the police. Over half of this consisted of the shares of Roger Corddry, £141,000, and allegedly Brian Fields, £100,000. A further £36,000 was recovered from Jimmy White's caravan. Roy James was carrying £12,000 when he was captured. The final sum of money recovered was £47,245. That was astonishingly found in the telephone box in Greater Dover Street, Newington, South London. The £47,245 recovered from a telephone box included 57 notes whose serial numbers had been recorded by the bank in Scotland. This money was part of a deal struck with Frank Williams by Danny Pembroke. In The Train Robbers, Piers Paul Reed claimed that the police were feeling the pressure because although they had caught many of the robbers, they had failed to recover much of the money that was stolen. While no evidence had been found against Danny Pembroke, he was believed to have been one of the South Coast raiders. Some of the identifiable banknotes had been traced back to Mr. Pembroke through friends who had been charged with receiving stolen money. Given that the police had insufficient evidence against Mr. Pembroke, either at Leatherslade Farm or definitive connection with either of the two gangs, Mr. Butler was prepared to let Mr. Pembroke go. Mr. Williams convinced Mr. Butler to pull Mr. Pembroke in for questioning, and in return for releasing him and not charging his friends with more serious crimes, £50,000 was to be returned to Mr. Pembroke and his friends. On the 3rd of December 1963, which happened to be the same day that Roy James was taken into custody, the police received an anonymous tip directing them to the money in the phone box. The money was driven up to Asbury and taken into custody by Detective Superintendent Futrell. who wondered how his London colleagues could know how much money there actually was. Mr. Futrell had to bring in bank clerks to count the damp and musty money to determine the final sum. Mr. Williams made no admission to the recovery of the money is the result of a deal with Mr. Pembroke. Despite claiming that his negotiations were responsible for the return of this money, Mr. Williams, in his book No Fixed Address in 1973, claimed not to know the identity of the person who had returned the money. Although Mr. Williams did mention several robbers to whom he had offered deals through intermediaries. Mr. Williams noted that it seemed to him that Mr. Butler was sceptical of his efforts, and that at the press conference Mr. Hathrell and Mr. Millen did not reveal the circumstances behind the find, and that Mr. Williams was never asked to talk with them about it. Despite Mr. Pembroke being the man identified as the assailant of the train driver, Jack Mills, by Bruce Reynolds, Mr. Williams only makes mention of the assailant once in his book. In this section, often quoted by other sources, Mr. Pembroke confirms that, with Tommy Butler, he questioned the man they knew to be the assailant, but they had no evidence to convict this man. Strangely, however, Mr. Pembroke makes no further mention of this man. The deal done with Mr. Pembroke caused outrage in the police hierarchy. It is hinted in several books that the deals done by Mr. Williams were responsible for him being overlooked for promotion, and that Mr. Williams was unhappy that his efforts were not recognised by his superior, Mr. Butler, but were instead hidden from Mr. Butler's superiors. For his part, George Hathrell, in his book A Detective's Tale, stated that the motive behind the return of the money was not known for certain. Mr. Hathrell said that the money was returned by one about whom extensive inquiries had been made, and who in fact was interrogated at length. But in spite of our strong suspicions, nothing could be proved against Mr. Pembroke, and so no charge could be brought. My belief is that Mr. Pembroke thought we knew more about him than we did, and thinking things were getting hot, Mr. Pembroke decided to get rid of the money to avoid being found in possession with it. Mr. Hathrell does not mention Mr. Williams at all in his book. Mr. Hathrell retired on the last day of the trial at Aylesbury. The 19 gang members who were arrested shortly after the robbery had to spend a large amount of legal fees, which was approximately £30,000 each, which was a heavy sum of money for those times. The robbers who spent much time on the run overseas, Mr. Reynolds, Mr. Wilson and Mr. Edwards, had very little left when finally arrested, having had to spend money avoiding capture and indulging in the lavish lifestyles without finding employment. Much of Jimmy White's money was taken from him. According to Marilyn Wisby, her father's share was hidden by his father, Tommy Wisby Sr., in the panels in the doors of his father's home. Mr. Butler raided them 3 times, but failed to find the train robbery money. The majority of the money was reputedly entrusted to Mr. Wisby's father and also to his younger brother, Ron, who coincidentally had saved some money of his own that was confiscated by the police and returned to Ron 3 months later after being verified to be legitimate money. By the time Mr. Wisby was released from jail, all of his shares had either been spent or invested. Mr. Marilyn agrees with Piers Paul Reed's assessment of how her father's share was up. Approximately £150,000 was spent. Although Mr. Wisby's share was one that was not taken by other criminals, Marilyn Wisby is still bitter that her relatives got to spend a fair amount of the loot while the overall sum dwindled away. However, Marilyn Wisby's grandfather used some of the money to buy them a house in Upper Norwood. Up to 6 of the robbers escaped punishment in one way or another. The Ulster man, 3 robbers who were never caught, John Daly, who had his charges dismissed at the trial, and Ronnie Biggs, who escaped from jail and managed to avoid being taken back to the United Kingdom. Mr. Daly had entrusted his money to another crook. This man had betrayed Mr. Daly to the police and had absconded with the money. Upon the release of the others in the mid-1970s, Bill Jennings got in touch with Buster Edwards, and Frank Monroe got in touch with the South Coast Raiders. Both said that they had no money left. Danny Pembroke went initially to America, and John Daly at the time was said to be living on unemployment benefits in the west of England. Ronnie Biggs quickly spent his share getting a new life. Ronnie Biggs loved his life in Australia, although by the time his family had arrived in 1966, all but £7,000 had been spent. £55,000 had been paid as a package deal to get him out of the UK. The rest had gone on legal fees and expenses to keep him out of jail and living a normal, comfortable life. With all the variations of the proceeds and life of the Great Train Robbery being speculated by many of the train robbers and police, who makes the best case for the truth? Please let us know what you think about the story of the Great Train Robbery of 1963 in the comments below. Thanks for joining us, and until next time, stay safe.